All right, we are live. Thank you for joining us again. Today we're going to be talking about whether or not the Quran contains advanced scientific knowledge, or what is sometimes referred to as scientific miracles. I'm sure you've probably heard by now that Ali Dawah recently came out and said that there are no scientific miracles in the Quran, or more precisely, he said that the argument has been debunked and he would recommend people not using it. Many Muslims in his own comment section and elsewhere have disagreed, said that Ali Dawah doesn't know what he's talking about, or his knowledge is not very good on this particular area. And thus, I have invited on Nadir Ahmed, Muslim apologist, who is going to be giving his response to this. Of course, it's not just Ali Dawah that's saying this. Other people have said it in the past. Oh, it looks like my program crashed here. Not quite sure what happened, so I'm just going to restart it and hope for the best. Might have tried to send a message that was too long. I'm not sure. Uh, it's directly related to this comment here from John Wilson. Thaddeus, would you be so kind to explain the point system? So it's brand new, still working out some of the bugs for sure. And yeah, so I'm just going to have to give me 1 second to disable that real quick, because it seems that it is crashing. So I'm just going to disable the send chat thing, restart it. Oh God. So brand new. We're working out some of the bugs, but I've implemented a kind of point system. This is kind of borrowed from Twitch, where it's kind of a built-in feature that within the Twitch ecosystem, they have what are called channel points, where the streamer can set it up such that people have the opportunity to, well, by watching, they get points, and then they can do things with those points to trigger things on the stream, like trigger an animation, trigger a sound effect, uh, just things that are fun for the audience. Like, it's not like you're making money or something, but gives the audience an opportunity to have fun things. I just implemented it. I did not have an opportunity to do a write-up. I do plan to do a write-up, which will explain exactly how it works, but that's kind of the gist of it. And for now, you're just earning them. You're not, there's no way to spend them yet. I haven't added that yet, but it's definitely coming. So right now, just be aware that they exist and look for more details on that in the coming days. All right. So with that out of the way, let me open us with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together. Thank you for the opportunity to connect with people with different beliefs from all around the world. People are Christians, people are Muslims, perhaps some people who are atheists or generic deists who have no particular religion, or they're a member of another organized religion. As that you be with everyone who is watching this, and that you help them perceive the truth. That whatever is true becomes apparent, and anything that is false is quickly forgotten. As that you be with me on a personal level, as I'm still overcoming a bit of an illness, that you give me the strength and perseverance to get through today's presentation. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Alrighty. So I temporarily disabled the robot, so you won't be able to check your points at this minute. I'll figure that out later. I don't want to interfere with the stream for that. I made some changes yesterday, and it seems that it wasn't working quite right, so I just went ahead and disabled it. So there's nothing to do with that in the chat today. We're going to start with a couple clips just to give us a context of what we're talking about today. We'll start with Ali Dawah since he is the one that kind of brought this to the forefront right now. So I took a couple minute segment, or about a minute actually, from his presentation or his most recent video, and that is not adding to my screen. Hold on 1 second. What's going on here? Sorry about the technical glitches here, everyone. Oh, there it goes. It was just slightly delayed for some reason. It added on its own before I even did anything else. Go figure. All right, let's go ahead and play this first clip here.
Because a lot of people were very insecure because of the scientific, discoveries or whatever it may be, and we was trying to fit the scientific narrative into the Quran, which was a big mistake because it's as good as we were making science the guideline for the Quran to be accepted. This is nonsense. Yeah, we take the Quran, not science. To hell with science. Science changes tomorrow, today. They talk about the Big Bang. Now there's new studies or whatever, the new findings that there was no Big Bang. So my point is what? You cannot come and say this verse here is a scientific miracle, is a scientific fact. Why? Not because the Quran is wrong, because science changes, number one. Number two, who told you that verse in the Quran is talking about what you're ascribing to it? Simple as that. So that's why I repeat it one more time for my fans, those Islamophobes. The scientific argument, the scientific miracles in the Quran is debunked. And we as Muslims, guess what? It doesn't bother us in the least.
All right, so that segment kind of give us a opening flavor for Ali Dawah here. Your thoughts on what Ali Dawah has to say there, Nadir?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me first start off by saying that I appreciate what he does, and from time to time I do watch his channel. So it's nothing against him personally, and I wish him the best. But unfortunately, he's really espousing a lot of ignorance on the subject, and I think where it stems from, it's from people like Hamza Tzortzis, who has put out some misguided videos. All of what he is saying has been debunked, and unfortunately, these guys, they do not want to come forward to have a discussion like we're having right now today. In fact, I want to thank you, Thaddeus, for putting this together. I forgive you for all the rotten things you've said about me in the past. I know it's part of the business, but yeah, I mean, what if science changes? That's a very easy question to answer. But I think that the most important thing here is all of what he's talking about is Quran and Science 1.0. So the Quran and science has many different branches. The first one is what he's referring to about the scientific miracles, and yes, that all can be defended. But where the real scientific miracle is how the Quran and the Hadith, how Prophet Muhammad corrects the scientific errors of the Bible. So this is something which Ali Dawah, Hamza Tzortzis, and others than them, they are just not aware of. And so it's just a matter of ignorance.
So Mojo Dude says, isn't Ali adopting our view of scripture and imposing it on the Quran in a way? I'm not 100% sure what he's getting at with that. I think that maybe he's saying that you don't. I'm not really 100% sure, because the Christian view of scripture is that it's inspired by God, that it is written by human beings reflecting their own culture. So I assume that's what he means, but I'm not really seeing how that relates to what Ali Dawah says, because what he's saying is that he's not saying that Allah isn't responsible for the text. He's saying that you as a human being are imposing your interpretation on Allah, and how do you know that you are correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So right. So let me go ahead and fix this problem very quickly. The confusion he's having here. So this is also will answer him on the question of what if science changes. So first of all, when we point out that there is a verse in the Quran which agrees with science, we never say that verse of the Quran is talking about that scientific fact. Because if science changes, then you're stuck, as Ali was pointing out, but you're creating your own problem here. So rather the Islamic, this is again, this is all talking about Quran and Science 1.0. Everybody should be on 2.0. But like I said, let me go ahead and answer that. So how you answer that is, look, when we point out there is a verse in the Quran which agrees as modern science. Like let's just take an example. There's an ayat in the Quran which talks about in the seas there are barriers. And therefore, and that's what science tells us. Science say there are barriers in the sea. It's called a picnic line. So we never say, look, the Quran is talking about that scientific fact. Rather, we say one of the many interpretations does agree with science. So, and we give the other possible interpretations. Like, for example, well, those barriers could be referring to islands. So, let's say science changes now and science says, okay, well, there's no longer any barriers in the sea. Those are actually, it's just our mistake we did. So now so now we can come back and say, oh yeah, well we've always pointed out that the verse was open for interpretation, and we even told you it could be islands. So that way we're safe if science changes. That's how you fix the problem. So you might ask, okay, then where's the miracle in all of that? The fact that you do have one legitimate interpretation which agrees with science, now that's interesting. That's an unusual phenomenon. We don't just jump to the conclusion, oh, that's a scientific miracle based on that, but rather, if we see that unusual phenomenon appearing again and again and again in the data, that's where we sound the alarm. That's where we say, hey, look, wait a second here. Why is it that when we look at these verses, there's a lot of legitimate interpretations which do agree with modern science here. And for that, there's no human explanation. There you go. The problem of what if
Well,
Quran
I
and
would
science
say
changes,
that
is
well,
fixed.
so the problem here, right,
Yeah,
is that humans are very creative.
sure.
I would say that humans have the ability to come up with interesting interpretations, and this is not like something special to the Quran. I have certainly seen,
Hmm.
while it's not a popular argument in Christianity the way it is in Islam, I've seen Christians do the same thing with the Bible, where they'll take a Bible verse and they'll assert that
Hmm.
this is talking about spaceships or cars or uh, some
Hmm.
clearly modern invention, and saying that it's predicting it, or that it's scientifically accurate about the Big Bang, or all kinds of things. And I think that the problem here is that uh, now what you said is reasonable, and that you're saying that's just one
Hmm.
possible interpretation. But when the possible interpretations are only bounded by human imagination, it's really hard to say that there's anything interesting going on other
Hmm.
than, well, it is interesting that humans can be that creative, but anything like that could be used as evidence. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so let me share my desktop here real quick. So yeah, I mean, again, I think we all agree that we shouldn't just because you see I mean, we shouldn't just jump to the conclusion based on this one agreement that okay, this is talking about that scientific fact. So if we do find one legitimate interpretation, and that is a legitimate interpretation, it could be referring to the picnic line, which is that barrier in the seas, which the scientists have, talked about. I mean, we can't rule out that possibility. But when we do see an agreement with science, by the way, could you share my desktop here real quick? Okay,
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah, I
Yeah,
did.
yeah. You got to call the cops. And the cops is just an acronym which stands for coincidence. Maybe it's just a coincidence that happened. It could be referring to barriers. And then maybe it's something which is obvious. Maybe it's something plagiarized, or maybe he was a great scientist. So every time you see an agreement between the Quran and one of its valid interpretations of the Quran and science, you call the cops. Where the miracle is in the frequency, not the individual occurrence. Meaning, okay, great. Maybe we're not going to jump to the conclusions that the barrier is referring to the picnic line. Cops can explain that. But if I were to show you six or seven different more examples of this, where well, there you go again, another valid interpretation. This could be referring to a scientific fact. Cops can't explain that anymore. Okay, because you can't pass that off as coincidence for that unusual occurrence happening six, seven times in a row. So that is where the Quran is a scientific miracle.
So I agree kind of with the principle that you're outlining here, that
Hmm.
one piece of evidence doesn't have to tell the whole tale. That you're looking at the cumulative case. You're not just looking at one piece of evidence and saying this one piece of evidence is absolute proof. But I think you're going to have a very hard time distinguishing between what is sufficient number of what could be coincidences or borrowings from other ideas, and or the other two possibilities you offer as well. How do you define what number is sufficient for it to count as good evidence, right?
So, what I like to do, the starting lineup for the Quran and science arguments is ones which have not been mentioned in any previous book. So, like for example, picnic line barriers is not mentioned in any previous book, so that's a good one. But there's going to come to a time where coincidence will be ruled out. Like for example, if you saw this occurrence just happening 2 or 3 times in a row of the Quran agree, one of its valid interpretations is agreeing with modern science, by right around the third or fourth, you're kind of expecting this to happen again. Why? Because you saw it just happen 3 times in the past. So that rules out coincidence. Because if you're expecting this to happen now, we can no longer argue this to be a coincidence. So I would say the number should go right around 3 or 4, maybe 5 at the tops, and then we've pretty much produced it as a scientific miracle.
That is a pretty low number, I would say, that you only need 3 or 4, because I think that you're going to be able to do that with any text. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and take a look at the next clip here. Sorry, 1 second. So this one is going to start with a little bit of Zakir Naik, because that is what Muhammad Hijab and his friend are responding to. So we're first going to get the context of what they're looking at, and then we'll see their response to what Zakir Naik has to say.
Today is the age of science and technology. So let us analyze today whether this glorious Quran is compatible or incompatible to modern science. Whether does it pass the test of today.
So as you can see here, guys, basically the premise here, I think the presupposition is that the Quran ought to be 100% consistent with modern day science. And why is this a flawed premise?
Because you're taking science now as something being undeniable, unequivocal truth.
Yeah.
And now you're applying that to the Quran. The reality is that there is nothing, as you covered before in your previous videos, Zakir, there is nothing that is considered an undeniable reality in science. It's something that is, changes constantly from day to day, and you can't say that there's 0% error in anything.
Yeah, and it's interesting, there's some books that were written, and we do reference them a lot in our polemics. Like, for example, one of them is called The Structures of Scientific Revolution by Thomas Kuhn, who talks about the change in science, and he actually refers to it as a paradigm shift. So science is not only do scientific facts change, and I'm using the word facts, not only do quote-unquote scientific facts change, but the whole framework within which science operates in is also can change. So the point being is that we cannot use science as a definitive measure of truth, since it itself is not definitely true.
And then apply that to the Quran, which we believe is the word of Allah, the speech of God, which is an undeniable truth.
Exactly. Right.
And you cannot say that this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meant in this particular verse.
As a matter of 100%.
100% certainty.
Okay, and I was going to ask you also on that point, this might sound a bit controversial, but the fact that you've put science as what you call yaqini, meaning 100% certain truth, and you've made the Quran in the first instance dhanni, could this be a kind of, what is this?
It's I don't want to use any strong terms, but without a shadow of a doubt, it's something completely incorrect, and it does fall into speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without knowledge, and there may be a certain aspect of kufr linked to this, a certain aspect of disbelief linked to this as well.
There you go. Kind of the same basic ideas as what Ali Dawah was saying, and they're saying it in response to Zakir Naik. They're saying that Naik, by proposing using science to test whether the Quran is true or not, has done something improper. He's elevated science to the higher standard Whereas, in their opinion, you should judge science based on the Quran, not the other way around. And then they also say kind of the same idea as Ali Dawah, that you don't necessarily know what a verse of the Quran means. So just because you go to it and you say it means, X, and X corresponds to what the science says, that doesn't mean you're correct, because that might not be the intended meaning of the verse. And in this series of videos, they look at a whole bunch of Zakir Naik's arguments, and it's varied about how plausible they think it is, but by and large, they mostly say that none of these interpretations were ever supported by any classical tafsir. This is innovation. This is Zakir Naik making up a new interpretation, and it should be thrown out. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think, with all due respect to Muhammad Hijab, but he's very confused on this matter. And I think the problem is he's exporting his confusion to other people, because people take him as, kind of a valid source. Nobody is taking science and saying this is an absolute and therefore judge Islam by science. We're not doing that. What we're saying is, look, it's going to happen whether you like it or not. So let's roll with the punches. Let's see what science is saying, and let's see what the Quran is saying. Again, this also goes back to the issue where they're completely oblivious of how science is actually changing on them, in the fact that now we have a new branch of Quran and science. There's 4 branches of Quran and science. The second branch is how Muhammad is correcting the scientific errors of the Bible. And that is a scientific miracle. So we're not saying, oh, look, you're using science as some, unquestionable, unchallengeable thing here. But what we're saying is, hey, wait a second. I know what you're doing. You, whoever wrote the Quran and Hadith, we know you knew these were in error. And you provided a fix for it, and you did a great job. And for that definitively, positively identifies you as a true prophet, because only a prophet of God would have known, though that book is in error, and not just in error. Remember, the scientific errors of the Bible causes needless misery and suffering in people's lives, and the fact that you try to alleviate that suffering proves you are a true prophet. So if you want to know what I'm talking about, watch my debate with David Wood on Quran and science, in which I laid out the case for him, and it paralyzed him. And that's why he's running. He's running because he knows there's validity to this case.
Well, I don't think that David's actually running from you. And we'll get a chance to talk about your methodology in some detail here in a minute. But I do have another clip, this one from Hamza Tsortsis, that I want to put out there as well, just to kind of get all the perspectives, all the kind of the main people saying these things. I'm sure there's others, but Hamza's kind of the one that led this. He's been saying it for a number of years. He used to be a big proponent of scientific miracles himself. Right. And then he, after getting into debates with atheists and such, he wrote a kind of an open letter to Muslims saying that these arguments are embarrassing. They are leading people to reject Islam unnecessarily. They have embarrassed me personally, and we should abandon these arguments. So here is a video clip, not saying those exact words, but of him kind of explaining his position.
We shouldn't be arguing scientific miracles in the Quran. It's not the right approach. We shouldn't be doing that. But what we're saying is, don't impose narratives onto the Quran itself, right?
And don't use a flawed methodology, because as we discussed, science is transient, is time-bound, and using a time-bound, limited, transient methodology to prove something that you believe is timeless.
Yeah, that's the most powerful.
It's flawed, absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with something currently now scientifically contradicting the Quran. Yeah. Big deal. Where has science come from? Understand its philosophy, its method, how scientists derive knowledge from empirical data.
Yeah.
And if you understand that, you see, well, it might change. Next week they may say this, in 1 month this, in 1 year this. Yeah. And we've seen this when you look into the history of science, right? Yeah. Take even evolution. Evolution has evolved as well in terms of the scientists understanding what evolution is from that perspective. So we need to relax and take a chill pill. However, the reason we're we're adamant in producing this narrative is because we need to change the narratives in the Dawa, in calling people to Islam, because frankly it has created a lot of doubts and it's created a lot of what I call apostasies, because people have left the religion of Islam because the only thing we gave them was scientific miracles.
Yeah.
And then when they understood what science was, and they understood that actually, you know what, there was knowledge at the time, there was exchange of cultures, it decreases the so-called miracle claim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what he is saying is that, people hear this argument, and in an atmosphere of ignorance, it sounds good. Like, oh, okay, so the Quran contains advanced scientific knowledge. That is good evidence that it is from God. I'm going to accept Islam, right? And then later on, they hear counter arguments. They find out that most of the things pointed to were readily known in Muhammad's time. They're known in the 7th century. They weren't like new knowledge. And they also probably are pointing to things that on the surface appear to be blatant scientific errors. And then they're saying, well, I don't have any other reason to believe in Islam. So if this is why I accepted it, now this is why I reject it.
Yeah. So what I would say to that is, I respect Hamza Tzortzis, but I think he is the problem here. He is the one who is creating the confusion. And that's why he doesn't want to have these type of public discussions. He's seen my refutation videos. He knows all about this, and he's now insulated himself because he doesn't want to admit he's wrong. Okay. The apostasies, with all due respect to him, is really a big part of it is because of your gas. I'm talking to you, I'm talking to him. His mistakes and errors, which he made because he never understood it to begin with. And then he exported that confusion to everybody else. People are calling him Ustad and just blindly following him. So if I were to look at this in retrospective, I would say the problem is not that, there's scientific error in the Quran. All of them have been successfully debunked to the point that now it's the atheists who are on the run from this debate because they know they cannot win this debate. But what happened here is, so there's no issue of people finding scientific error in the Quran. It's in complete harmony with modern science. We can even look at a couple examples today if you're not convinced. But the problem is that he had many failures and he doesn't want to own up to that. Quran and science is perfectly valid, but all of this is nonsense to begin with because we're all just talking about Quran and Science 1.0. Quran and Science 1.0 is about, look, there's many verses in the Quran which agrees with modern science, which today we have just recently discovered. How could a man 1,400 years ago know this? Okay, then that's valid. But we're now on a new version of Quran and Science, which they are completely oblivious of, which is how the Quran corrects the scientific errors of the Bible and thus starts alleviating the misery and suffering caused by those errors. I would like to give you an example, Thaddeus, just so we can look at it.
I have one more clip, and then I would like to talk a little bit about your methodology, and then I'll get to your examples. So this will be the last clip.
Yes.
This is going back to Ali Dawah here, and it's from the same video, but he gives a specific example of why he thinks that this is a bad argument. So we're going to go ahead and watch that now. Let me just make sure that's working. Yes, okay.
The scientific miracles argument in the Quran got debunked. Yeah, I hope my tajweed was on point. So when I said this, a lot of Islamophobes were celebrating as if I was like, oh my gosh, like this video is going to be me apologizing. And no, listen, it got debunked. Now let's give some context for some Muslims so they can understand. For example, and I'll tell you where this comes from, and you know why many people in the Dua, many Duat, YouTubers, my colleagues, like brothers that I work with, didn't do a video. Why did you say that? Because they know it as well. In what sense? Brothers and sisters, I was having a debate with a guy called Phil. Yes? This guy is a scientist or whatever he is, for that matter. I was debating with him, and I can remember this very clearly a couple of years ago. And I took an ayah in the Quran, which I am not qualified to do, which is it's like doing tafsir. So there was an ayah in the Quran which says that there are 7 heavens. So I was claiming, because of this whole scientific narrative, that this is talking about the ozone layer. Number one, it is haram for me to do that. Why? Because how can I give an understanding to the Quran, the ayah, with no qualifications? And who have ever said that this is the ozone layer? Then I was having a debate with this atheist guy and trying to tell him that there's 7 ozone layers. And he was saying to me, no, my friend, there are 6 ozone layers. And I was saying 7. He was saying 6, 7, 6, 7, 6. And we say, let's go to the NASA page. So we went to the NASA page, and in the NASA page, guess what? It said the argument was apparently from the recent findings, whatever it may be. It's probably changed. And this is my whole point of the video, yeah? Science changes. It said that there is 5 ozone layers. So I looked at him, he looked at me, and I was thinking, I'm saying 7, you're saying 6, NASA is saying 5. That is where the penny dropped for me.
Yeah.
So he provides a specific example. He calls it ozone layers. He really means layers of the atmosphere. Kind of gives you a clue of how much Ali Dawah knows about science there when he's calling it ozone layers.
Yeah.
When in fact there's only one ozone layer. But his point is that, he was trying to make this argument. He was trying to say that the 7 heavens of the Quran refers to the 7 layers of Earth's atmosphere. And I have heard, this is an art. It's not like one of the most popular, but it's definitely one that's out there. And, he's debating an atheist, and the atheist was saying that there was actually 6 layers. And then he decided to look it up, and he found that there was 5. So he's saying 7, 6, 5. What's going on here? And his conclusion is basically, I was misreading the Quran. And that verse has nothing to do with Earth's atmosphere, has nothing to do with this kind of scientific reasoning whatsoever. It's describing something completely different, and it would be wrong to import that meaning onto the text. So how do you decide what is a correct meaning? Because Ali Dawah says, I'm not qualified. This is a novel interpretation that no one has ever come up with until modern times. It was wrong for me to do that. Now you're going to say that when we look at certain verses of the Quran, that we can validly look at those verses. Now, if I go to other ones, you'll probably say that we can't validly call those scientific statements. So how do you determine what counts as a scientific statement and what doesn't?
So he's tripping over his own feet. I mean, he's creating his own problem. First of all, he's reading into the Quran science, and that's a valid point. How do we know what is a valid understanding, what is a valid interpretation? I'll answer this. So all the problems which he's pointing out have valid solutions, but a big part of the problem here is them, that they don't understand it from the very beginning. Stop interpreting the verse. Stop saying this stuff is ozone layers. So without further ado, let me show you how we know what would be a valid interpretation. My rule is it's got to be word for word agreement. Let's take a look. I'm going to share my desktop here real quick. Here is if you can see my screen. Here is an example of a word-for-word agreement with the Quran, with Quran and science. Science here says today that the picnic line acts as a barrier. There are barriers in the sea. The Quran talks about the seas. There's barriers. Now, look, I'm not going to interpret anything, but we can clearly see that there is a word-for-word agreement between the Quran and science. But now, does this make it a miracle? No. You got to go to the next step, and you got to call the cops. Coincidence, obvious, plagiarized. Maybe he himself was a scientist. That's why you see this word of, this word for word agreement there. But so there's no miracle here at this point. So as you can see, cops can explain everything which if he would educate himself on these issues, it could explain all of it beautifully. And I'll even show you another example if you have time. But I know if you want to see another example, I can show you that.
Yeah. So we'll come to some specific examples in a minute, and I'm comfortable talking about the barrier example if you want to talk about that one. But first, I want to kind of get some clarity here. So you have your criteria, which are COPS, which are actually very similar to criteria that I came up with on my own. My criteria was, well, one, that it must be true, which is kind of implied in your COPS. Now, sometimes Muslims have given me, scientific miracles which don't match current scientific consensus, which doesn't seem to be very good evidence to me. So that one kind of is a duh, right? That it has to go beyond what someone in the 7th century could observe. So that would correspond to your scientist, right? The S in COPS. Claim knowledge must be new to the Quran. So that would correspond to your possibility of plagiarism.
Mhm.
Now, I think plagiarism is kind of an anachronism, but we get the idea, right? That the idea already existed,
Mhm.
and therefore you can't say it's miraculous. The Quran must actually say what the apologist claims it says.
Mhm.
So this is kind of the tricky one here, right? How do you know that your interpretation is correct? I'll come back to that in 1 second. The last one I had was that must go beyond a lucky guess, so that would correspond to your coincidence. So what I propose for knowing that the Quran, that is an actual possibility for the text, is that there must be a pre-scientific tafsir that sees that as one of the possible meanings of the verse. It doesn't mean that there has to be unanimous consensus that this is the only meaning, like Ali Dawah and or Muhammad Hijab kind of argued. Um, but I think that at least someone should have seen it, because
Mhm.
if this is kind of a check to make sure that we're not reading our own imagination into the text. So,
Mhm.
what do you think about that proposal that it has to be in a tafsir for us to be able to consider that possibility?
No, I would disagree with that because the tafsir is not comprehensive knowledge of the Quran. Every single understanding, every single verse has been explained away, and nobody can can understand anything more than what we have written down. So that's kind of a false premise. But let's just go along with it. Let's just test that hypothesis and see if it makes sense. Let's say we have a tafsir which explains everything and says you are not allowed to look at for any other meaning than what I'm giving you. Let's just pretend we've got that. That still won't explain that unusual phenomenon. So yeah, okay, the meaning of the word about barriers in the tafsir, it actually says it's referring to islands. Okay, great. But guess what? It also agrees with modern science. So that would fall under a coincidence. And so we keep going through my list. I think you mentioned three or four is too little. I could go up to eight if you like. Let's say I go through my list of 8 verses here, and every one of them, we can say Ibn Abbas explained every single one of those verses to mean something else. At the end of the day, that still doesn't answer the question, why do we see that unusual phenomenon occurring over and over and over again? So that's where what we call, it's not so much of a miracle as we don't have a natural explanation for the occurrence of this unusual phenomenon, in that one of its valid interpretations does agree with science. And when we call it a scientific miracle, I think that's just the best explanation for it. So I think,
Yeah, well, I mean,
yeah.
I think that the term is probably kind of a misnomer, but the idea that there's advanced scientific knowledge, I think we can agree that if that actually was the case and it actually held up to scrutiny, that would be valid evidence that there
Mhm.
was a all-knowing divine source behind the text.
Mhm.
I think that the principle is correct.
Mhm.
That now what I'm going to disagree here is that there's no natural explanation. And I think that the natural explanation is going to be human creativity. That,
Mhm.
that human beings are seeing meaning in the text that isn't actually there.
Mhm.
And we can discuss that in more detail when we get to specific examples.
Sure.
But I did want to ask you about a few of the common examples, and then you can kind of explain how this is different than your approach. You can say whether you agree that these are good,
Mhm.
um, or at least plausible, uh, miracles, uh, plausible incidences of advanced
Mhm.
knowledge, or not. And then you can kind of say how that contrasts with your approach, what you call the 2.0 approach,
Right.
because you might be unique in this 2.0 approach. I've never heard it from anyone else. So what Muslims usually do is they go to things, they say things like the Quran teaches the Big Bang, or if they're not being as bold, they at least say it teaches the expansion of the universe. So what do you think about
Mhm.
that one?
Yeah. So, yeah, I heard the discussion taking place with God Logic on the expansion of the universe, and then there a big debate which kind of broke out over what that word expansion means. I think I think they're weak arguments. It just doesn't make the final cut of what we should be using when we go to when we go to battle against whether they're atheists or Christians, we want to make sure that they are the most clearest ones which we use, which are not open for reinterpretation. We don't have a problem of other, like what we saw from the discussion there. And when you get to this final cut, they may not be that impressive, as a big bang and the universe is expanding, but nevertheless, they are valid scientific claims. So my advice for Muhammad Hijab, Ali Dawah, and Tzortzis, come to me and find out which are those scientific arguments which are on that final cut, which are indisputable agreement with modern science. It's not a lot, so let's go with that. And let's use that, and that will solve 95% of your problems.
Excellent. So you can either give details, or you can just kind of give a quick answer saying, I don't think that's a great argument. But I do want to get to the other most common ones.
Sure.
Since you paid attention to that discussion, you also heard raising that all living things are made of water. What do you think of that one?
It doesn't make the final cut. Don't use it.
Okay. The iron being sent down from space might be the most popular of all. What do you think of that one?
It doesn't make the final cut.
Excellent. Let's see. What else do I hear fairly often? That mountains prevent earthquakes. I hear that one pretty often.
Well, first of all, that could be, it is a misunderstanding of science, and it is a misunderstanding of the Quran. I don't think either one is making the claim. So that doesn't make the final cut. But one thing I do want to point out, when I say it doesn't make the final cut, I'm not saying that it's not scientifically, that it could not be actually referring to a scientific fact. What I'm saying is you're going to have a lot of problems trying to prove that due to all the other issues that we're going to face when we go to battle. So that doesn't make the final cut.
Okay. You already alluded to the barriers between the seas, and I'm guessing you're saying that one is making the cut.
It makes the final cut.
Okay. So we might have a chance to talk about that one in a little bit. Audience, are there other ones that you want me to ask about? Let's put it that way. And by the way, I'm not paying much attention to the chat today, since I'm actively engaged in the discussion, and it's not like someone else is presenting, so I won't be able to pay very much attention to the chat today, but I want to see if there are other ones that want to get out there. DQS says, I want to see his final cut list, and we'll get to that definitely here in a minute. I'm not seeing any that people want to bring out. Embryology. Yes, of course. I should have asked about embryology. So do you think that the embryology of the Quran is advanced knowledge, or does it just reflect what was known at the time?
Well, I believe it is advanced knowledge. Now, again, I believe actually all the ones which you are referring to, I do believe they're actually pointing to the scientific fact. But the problem with embryology is it's just way too complicated. And we cannot get into a discussion like this with people and start teaching them embryology and all the different stages. I just think there's a more simpler path to victory than debating embryology, although I do believe it is valid. Yeah.
Excellent. Yep. So that's a good clarification, that you're not necessarily saying these things are inaccurate. You're just saying that they're not clear. They're probably not the strongest evidence that someone should use.
Right.
Since Ali Dawah mentioned the seven heavens, I think they probably have a good idea about that one. But what do you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, he was tripping over his own feet in the sense that he is reading science into the Quran, which you should never have done that to begin with. And then he says, oh, look, science doesn't work. No, the problem is not with science. The problem is with Ali Dawah. The problem is not with science. The problem is Hamza Tzortsis. This is where the issue is. You need to fix that problem.
I got a couple more here quickly. So it's been suggested that the Quran talks about the ocean being dark and deep. Would you think that is advanced knowledge?
That makes the final cut. We can prove that does agree with modern science. One of the valid interpretations is that there's no light at the bottom of the sea. That's pretty valid. Yeah, that makes the final cut.
Okay. I have a suspicion I know the answer to this one, but this one's kind of particular to Zakir Naik. He says that the Quran says that the earth is ostrich egg shaped.
No, it doesn't, because I mean, that does not make the final cut due to the fact that now you got to go into really understanding the Arabic language, and you've got to now teach the common people who don't even speak Arabic. And oh no, this is what it really means in Arabic, which was kind of like the fiasco we saw a couple of nights ago on God Logic's page with that person. It's all in the Arabic, so that does not make the final cut.
And then we have the number of bones, but he's really thinking of joints. That there is a particular. I think that might actually be a hadith that claims there's a particular number of joints. So what do you think about that one?
Yeah, so that one I did look a little bit into. It's possible it could make the final cut, but maybe I just don't know enough about it. Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I'm Breakfast Gun says birds migrating. Surely, I've never heard anyone claim that's a miracle.
Yeah.
But I mean, come on, that's easily observed. So I haven't heard that claim, so I don't want to ascribe that to Muslims claiming that's miraculous. Let's see. I see some people pointing out what we would call scientific errors. That's obviously not what I was going for, people. I'm aware of those verses. Don't worry.
No, we could talk about that. That's no problem.
Yeah. And if it comes up, we'll talk about it. But I just wanted to get your quick opinion on some of the common ones. So that's good enough. So you've kind of given us a flavor of why, or you didn't really say why they don't work, but you've given us a flavor of how the most popular arguments might not be the best argument. So how would you contrast someone, say, claiming that the universe is expanding and this being proof of its divine origin to the kind of things that you look at?
Yeah, so there's two problems with that. Is I think the expansion of the universe was mentioned in other books. Does it nullify our arguments? No, but now you've just added an extra layer of complexity where now you got to talk your way out of that. And then there's the issue of people interpreting that word to mean something different. So now you got to kind of learn some Arabic there. So due to those issues, even though it's a valid, all of these are valid arguments to be making, but when we go to battle, we need to go with the most clearest, indisputable verses, which so we can do away with all the debates on whether it really agrees with science. I mean, that is most clearest. And when you look at that list, it's not very many, but it's enough to get the job done.
Fair enough. And I know from experience talking to you, and you kind of alluded to it at the start, that what you try to do is you look for things where the Bible seems to teach one thing and the Quran teaches another thing, and you would suggest that these are the strongest cases to be made. Now, so I want to ask you two things about that. One, why do you think that this makes the argument stronger? And two, what is your justification for thinking that the Quran is correcting the Bible?
Yeah. So let's just take a look at the issue of alcohol. The Quran and the Bible is talking about a dangerous drug. Now, the immediate question which should come to your mind, now we're getting into Quran and Science 2.0. Let's see who does a better job. It's like this, like both Muhammad and Jesus are in a classroom and the teacher's writes on the chalkboard, alcohol, write something about it, go. Muhammad turns in his paper, Jesus turns in his paper. Let's see who does the better job here. I mean, certainly you can't do a better job than God. I mean, these are the questions which would pop up in our mind. I mean, if Jesus is God, he would not allow a false prophet to do a better job in handling this dangerous drug than he would. Those are some of the questions which we would raise. So now science has given its verdict on these very exact questions, and it is astonishing to see that. So that's what I would like to share with you, to see what does science actually say. Who does a better job, Muhammad or Jesus? Jesus of the New Testament.
I would definitely like to look at the alcohol example. But first, I want you to answer that second question. What is your justification? So you kind of explained in your answer there why that would be evidence, right? Because you're comparing the Bible and the Quran. Perhaps there's well, not really perhaps. There's definitely a background assumption there that one of those would be right. And so you're looking at which one is better. Now, an atheist or something, they're going to say, well, neither one is right. They're both, they're both written by human beings. They both make many errors. So I don't think that argument would be very compelling for an atheist. Now, I can see why you would pose that argument to a Christian. Nonetheless, I want to ask, what is your justification for thinking that the Quran corrects the Bible in the first place? Does the Quran tell you that it's correcting the Bible, for example?
Yeah. So there is a verse in the Quran which says that Allah created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and he did not rest. So wait a second here. Now, we know there is a verse in the Bible which says God created is it 6 days or seven? God created the heavens and earth in 6 days and then he rested on the seventh. We know that that's what's in the Bible. So from this one example, we can safely assume that Muhammad is going out of, or whoever wrote the Quran is going out of his way to correct what he's saying is wrong in the Bible. He's saying, oh wait, God rested on the seventh day. No, that's not true. Let me hear. God wrote God created the heaven and earth in 6 days and he didn't rest. So I think you would even agree this is a deliberate attempt to correct what the author is seeing, which is wrong, right?
You could say that, but if the author really wanted you to think that he's correcting things, why wouldn't he just say, I'm correcting? Like, at least tell you, like, somewhere in general, I've come to correct the inaccurate teachings of the Bible. And that's how you can know that I'm correct. Because when I read the Quran, it seems to affirm the truth of the Torah and the gospel many times. And never once seems to say that it has come to correct them.
Yes.
So what you're saying is that there's a difference here, right? And I would agree that with your statement, it is a possibility that it is intentional correction. It could also just be a difference, though, right? And he could just be saying, or he may not, or it could be correcting an idea that he thinks isn't in the Bible that some people are just saying. So again, what is your justification for saying that this is a very strong methodology, that the Quran's purpose, how you know it's true, is when it corrects the Bible?
Yeah. So going back to your initial point about the Quran confirming the Bible, so that's the debate I was going to do with David Wood on this, in which he basically said, if you could show me that the Quran is claiming the Bible is in error, I'll become a Muslim. So he's dragging his feet on that debate as well. So let's wait to hear on that. So we'll just put that issue on the back burner. But I think it's painfully obvious. I want to ask you a question now. You said, okay, it's a possibility that could be an attempt to correct. But okay, so Jesus talked about alcohol. He talked about the mustard seed. He talked about washing hands. He talked about meat consumption. And he talked about these things. Now, Muhammad comes 600 years later and talks about those same exact things. Is this all just a coincidence, or that's where I'm saying, wait a second, this can't be a coincidence. So my question for you, Thaddeus, is how do you explain Muhammad coming 600 years later and is talking about the exact same things Jesus is talking about?
Well, I don't think he's talking about the
There
exact
is.
same things. I think you found a few points of correspondence and ignored everything that didn't fit into your predetermined methodology of finding what you perceive to be a scientific error in the Bible and finding what you perceive to be the correction in the Quran. I mean, Jesus, those things that you outlined are like 5 sentences that Jesus spoke out of the hundreds and hundreds of sentences recorded in the gospel. And that's even assuming that you're interpreting those verses correctly to begin with. And then in the Quran, it's likewise like 5 verses out of the 6,000 verses of the Quran. So there's a huge amount that doesn't correspond. Now, I will agree that there are other things that correspond that are untestable, like claims about the unseen spiritual world that could potentially be corrections. But by and large, right, there's not a huge amount of correspondence between these texts.
Okay. Well, okay, even if you have a problem with correction, that the one book is correcting the other, let me rephrase that and just point out a fact that it's not so much as a correction. Then we can rephrase that to say, look, it's just doing a better job. what is undeniable, and I would like to share that evidence with you, Muhammad's answer on alcohol from a scientific perspective is superior than Jesus's. It's absolutely much better in every way, and from a scientific perspective, that is. And so that it goes back to the question of how do you beat God at his own game? I mean, how does an alleged false prophet produce scientifically superior answers? So even if you have a problem with correction, one book correcting the other, that conclusion cannot be avoided, which I just shared with you. And we can look at one example.
Okay. So you've kind of lowered the standard, but I find your new standard to be more acceptable. Asking which one does a better job.
Okay.
Now, granted, that has the very strong background assumption that one of these texts might be right, and I think that what you're going to find that you might be able to argue for certain points, and we'll get to those points here in a minute, but you're still going to be cherry picking. You're still going to be ignoring the vast majority of what is said in order to get these specific examples, and that's where the miracle's actually happening, or what in reality is a set of coincidence that might look good in isolation because it's several things. They all if we buy into your interpretations and ignore background material that I'll bring up, that it looks good, right? But when you look at the complete set of data and you don't see that on the other 95% of the data or the other 98% of the data, then it no longer looks significant. It just looks like a couple of coincidences. If it's 5 out of 5 or 8 out of 8, that might mean something. If it's 5 out of 100 or 8 out of 100, then that probably doesn't mean a whole lot. And I think that is definitely where we're going to disagree on that. But we can get into specifics, no problem.
Yeah, and I think at this point we can at least successfully say that Ali Dawah and Hamza Tzortzis and other than them have been successfully refuted because there's so much more. I mean, proving that the Quran is a scientific miracle is only one aspect of Quran and science. There's issues where the Quran is doing a better job of answering questions like on the drug of alcohol than other books. And it really looks like one book is correcting the other. So this is a avenue which they have never heard, they have never seen before, and they're just quite frankly ignorantly talking about things they know nothing about. So my sincere nasiha advice to them: get educated, watch this live stream, learn about the other branches of Quran and science, and go back and pull down those videos that you have misrepresented our religion, misrepresented Dr. Zakir Naik and other than them. And honestly, Thaddeus, what I feel is the problem is I think it's an issue of arrogance and pride. I think I don't want to mention any name specific, but that's why they do not want to talk about this openly like we are talking about these things, because they know they are wrong and they don't want to admit that they've misled a lot of people on this topic. But anyway, that is my opinion on that.
Yeah, so I definitely could agree with part of that. I definitely could agree that there is a lot of arrogance and pride. Some of that just comes with the territory of being a well-known public speaker. I think some of that is a personality defect among certain people as well. But nonetheless, now I wouldn't agree that they are wrong. I actually think they're making a very valid point. Even if I was a Muslim, I would think that they are making at least one very valid point, and that's that when you try to interpret a verse of the Quran that doesn't seem to be scientific, and then use that in a scientific way, like, for example, the seven heavens, right? Since we've talked about that a couple of times. To me, that verse is not describing something about physical reality. But so when you take that verse and you try to make it into something about physical reality, you're doing a great disservice to the text. You're kind of making science into the higher standard, the God, if you will. And I think it's really irresponsible. And I would say the same thing to Christians who do this with the Bible, Again, not as common, but it does happen that Christians will try to look at the Bible and they'll try to impose modern scientific understanding on it, and then they'll say that this is evidence of the truth of the Bible. And I think that that is wrong. I think that if you're confident in the text, then you should let the text speak for itself. You shouldn't try to find these hidden scientific meanings in the text.
Yes. Well, and I totally agree with you, Thaddeus. However, I don't feel like I'm doing that.
Well,
I'm just,
yeah, it was an
yeah,
accusation against you.
yeah. I'm
Yours
just
are
letting
a bit different.
Yeah, I'm letting the scripture read for itself. I'm carefully combing through and making sure I, remove all the ones where I find those inherent problems which you've pointed out. And I think I've come up with a list which will not suffer from those problems.
Hmm. So let's go ahead and get to a specific example. Let's
Sure.
go ahead and start with alcohol, since you've
Sure.
mentioned it a couple of times.
Yeah. And then I'll show you how science definitively positively identifies Muhammad as a true prophet from this one example. Well, I want to say one example. So let's give a couple examples. So let's see. So here's a study which was done. I know this is kind of hard to read. Let me make this a little bit bigger here.
Sorry. I did have a question from the audience.
Yeah.
Someone asked which Quran verse you were referring to when it says that Allah did not rest after creating.
Oh, man, let me find that for you. If you just give me a second here, I'll get that verse for you. In fact, let me just Google it. If you could see my desktop over here, let me just get that verse for you real quick. Created the seven what earth created the earth in 6 days, and that is in I don't know. I think it's this one right here. Yeah, here we go. It's chapter number 50, verse 38. And it says, and so basically, this is what my point here is. I think it's kind of obvious that the Quran is correcting the Bible on this, where it says that no weariness or tiredness has come to us. So it's like you kind of knew that what the Bible was saying, and you're correcting that. So here's
Well,
the verse.
I would say it's correcting if it's correcting something, it's correcting a misunderstanding of the Bible, because that's not actually what the biblical text means.
Well,
But
we
that's
we we
neither
can
here nor
debate that
there.
another time, perhaps.
Yeah, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah,
I just wanted to get the
I agree
verse
with
out
you.
there since there
Yeah.
was a request for it. So let's go ahead and look at alcohol.
Yeah. So this is I'm quoting the European Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. This is a research publication which was done. It's saying the Islamic faith promotes the abstinence of alcohol, and abstinence is high among Muslims. And so it's talking about a disease called fetal alcohol syndrome. This is where if the mother drinks alcohol, it can negatively affect the fetus, and thus, it causes some type of damage in the child. The scientists have concluded that Muslim women are 50 times less likely than the global average to have a fetal alcohol child. And unlike Christians, in contrast, wine is a part of the communion in the Catholic faith, and abstinence is much less common among Catholics. Now, this is just talking about Catholics, but really this is all Christians in general. So what the scientists is pointing people to here, they're saying, listen, if you want to study this disease, you got to go to the Christians. You're going to find it over here. But the question which I raise over here, two questions. The first question is, the first argument I'll make, there is something intrinsic about the Bible and the Quran which is causing this data to look the way it does. And the question which I'll have for you, Thaddeus, which I did debate David Wood on this in my Virginia Beach debate. If you just Google that, Virginia Beach debate with David Wood, and I'll ask the same question to you. If Muhammad is a false prophet, how do you explain an alleged false prophet saving millions of children from fetal alcohol syndrome, while the true Lord and Savior just let them perish? Both of them talked about alcohol. Both of them, gave an answer on this dangerous drug, but Jesus didn't do this. Why would have? That's the question I have for you. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think that we need to look at specifics. So let's start with the Quran verse. So I
I have it right
assume,
here for you.
yep. I assume that you're referring to, um, shoot, two, two, 2:19.
Chapter 5,
Correct?
verse 90. Chapter 5, verse 90.
We're going to go to 590. Okay, no problem. So, oh, you have believed, indeed, intoxicants, gambling, stone altars, and divining arrows are but defilement from the work of Satan, so avoid it that you may be successful. That's the translation I have in front of me. Obviously, different translations will say slightly different things, and I see that you're sharing your screen as well. Same idea, intoxicants, game of chance, so gambling, idol sacrifices at altars, and divining arrows are all abominations, the handiwork of Satan. So my first question for you is, if this verse is about the health benefits or health detriments of intoxicants, what are the health detriments of gambling or games of chance?
Well, let's go back to from a scientific perspective. From a scientific perspective, they don't care if you don't gamble. They don't care if you don't engage in magic. So from a scientific perspective, it's perfectly fine to say don't gamble. Now, of course, there's many horrors of gambling, which we won't even get into. But if you're trying to point out error in the verse, I don't think that's really the
Well,
right.
I'm not
Yeah,
trying to point
yeah,
out
yeah,
error.
yeah.
My purpose isn't to say that gambling's good, right?
Mhm.
I would agree that gambling is generally bad for you, uh, and sacrificing idols is bad for you, and casting spells or divining arrows is bad for you. But of these, the only one that has health implications,
Mhm.
as far as like physical health, is alcohol or intoxicants in general, whichever is the better translation of the verse. And what I'm getting at is it seems to be that these are things based on the other three things in it, that these are things that are detrimental to your spiritual well-being.
Mhm.
So why do you conclude then that this is making some kind of advanced statement about the physical effects of alcohol?
Mhm. Well, no, I'm not actually concluding that at all. I'm just raising a question. I mean, where you're trying to go with this is you're saying, look, that's not the intent of the verse, or maybe the author had a different intention other than to save all those millions of children from fetal alcohol syndrome. For that, I mean, we can never, from just this one example, I could never prove that or disprove that. But what I can say is, irregardless, it is still a fact that Muhammad gave a scientifically superior answer to Jesus on this. And I would ask that question again. I don't think it asks the question, it answers the question. How would you explain, irregardless of Muhammad's true intention, he did save millions of children from fetal alcohol syndrome, while Jesus Christ just let them perish? Both of them gave answers on alcohol, but Muhammad's answer was so much far superior. And maybe Ali Dawah can answer that. If he says, "Oh, science is don't use science," okay, why don't you answer that question too then? Or maybe all the Hamza Tzortsis can answer this. So go ahead.
So I definitely um, can do nothing but laugh at your
Mhm.
wording of saying Jesus is just letting all these children perish because fetal alcohol syndrome is less common, far less common, right, in the Islamic world than outside of it. That isn't the implication, and that kind of logic is saying, why is God allowing people to murder one another? Why is God
Mhm.
allowing car crashes? Why is God
Sure.
allowing all kinds of things that lead to human death? So to say that because fetal alcohol syndrome is far less common in Muslim worlds today doesn't, to me, sound like a very strong argument. And
Mhm.
here's why. Because there are plenty other things that are harmful that are more
Mhm.
prevalent in the Islamic world than outside.
Mhm.
Infectious disease is more common.
Mhm. Mhm.
Incest is more common. So just because something that is bad, right? I'm
Mhm.
not
Mhm.
disagreeing that fetal alcohol syndrome is bad and is a tragedy. But just because one particular type of human suffering is less prevalent in the Islamic world, uh, to me, unless this was like across the board in many, many different ways, uh, that somehow this makes for proof that, or really even evidence, that Muhammad is a true prophet. And
Hmm.
when I look at, and I'm going to, I, I agree. I can't dispute your outcome here, right? I can't dispute the research on fetal alcohol syndrome, but you've cherry picked that particular data point because it supports your point. If we look at what the biblical teaching on alcohol and the Quranic teaching on alcohol, they're not very different, actually. So it seems to be that a culture of not drinking alcohol has developed in the modern Islamic world. Wasn't always the case in the Ottoman Empire.
Hmm.
Alcohol was abundant and drunkenness was very common, for example. But because of the modern culture that has developed, it's less common. But I don't see it as a direct cause and effect from what the text says.
Hmm. Well, I would, first of all, I would agree with you that, you know, of course, God allows evil to take place in this world. We should not hold God accountable for because there's famine and drug addiction and things like that. Sure, of course not. That's an atheist argument. But what I'm pointing out here is, look, Jesus knew Muhammad was coming 600 years later. He knew that he's going to basically give his answer on this dangerous drug of alcohol. And he knew, I mean, if he's God, he knew he's going to do a pretty darn good job of it, much better than him. And I'm asking why? Why would he allow Muhammad to beat him on alcohol? And if he is truly
Well,
the
I mean,
God,
you could, okay, so why did God allow modern atheist scientists to do a much better job on infectious disease than either Jesus or Muhammad did?
Mhm,
Because
yeah,
most modern health benefits are due to the research of modern scientists.
mhm,
That's why we have antibiotics. That's why we have
mhm,
uh, cancer treatments. It's why we have all kinds of medical advances. Uh, all of that is developed within the last 150 years. Neither Jesus or Muhammad can take any credit for it. So why
mhm,
did God allow these scientists of various beliefs, some atheists, some Christians, some otherwise, to upstage him, right? And
mhm,
provide a much more strong solution to, say, infectious disease
yeah.
than either of the prophets gave.
Mhm. Yeah, so I don't think it was the intent of Jesus or Muhammad to be infectious disease specialists and start teaching these things and providing the cure for cancer, the cure for A. Well, I wouldn't say A. I was the cure for a lot of these things. So uh, I think that would be a mute point there. But what we can say here is both Jesus and Muhammad did provide answers on alcohol. Muhammad clearly did a better job than Jesus on this issue. Now, let me give you an analogy which I think would make it
Well,
more clear.
yeah,
Now,
but it
but
was
wait,
a
hold on a
direct
second.
answer to it was a direct answer to your
Yeah,
question to me,
yeah,
though. Why would
yeah.
God allow Muhammad to have a quote unquote better answer?
Mhm.
And it's the same thing as why he
Okay.
would allow atheists today to have a better answer on some other
Mhm.
issue.
Okay. And maybe I can accept your response to a certain extent so long as the point was made. Muhammad's answer is better on alcohol from a scientific perspective, that is. But I'll give you an analogy of what we're dealing with here. It's like, let's say there's a child, he's choking and dying on the floor, and his face is turning purple, and Jesus is just looking at him. 2 minutes later, Muhammad comes walking in the door. He's like, oh my God. And he just jumps on the kid and he takes out the food and saves the kid. The question is, you got to look at Jesus. Why did you just allow that to happen? That Muhammad had to come here and save these kids. So when you look at it from that perspective, you're like, no, 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 no. There's something wrong here, Thaddeus. Okay, and I remember now other Christians, like I was debating, or Sam Shimon and Christian Prince, they'll actually say Muhammad is a devil prophet. He's a demon or something like that. What? A demon is saving millions of children from fetal alcohol syndrome while the true Lord and Savior just let them perish. Now, if we look at this first example, maybe we cannot conclude that Muhammad is a true prophet, but you know what? We're really close. I have more examples of what I'm
Well,
sharing with you.
yeah, well, I'm not done with alcohol here because,
Okay.
okay, so your standard is that allegedly, Jesus gave one teaching on alcohol, and then it was corrected by Muhammad. Now, what is the standard Islamic teaching on the history of alcohol? Is this something that was forbidden right away the day Muhammad became a prophet, or was it something and that was, in theory forbidden by Jewish and Christian prophets, and then it got lost? They got lost the message, or is it something that Allah allowed for a while, and then at a particular point in time changed his previous ruling, abrogated it, and came up with a new ruling?
So this is a question about, about the Islamic stance of alcohol, which has already been addressed by academics. And in fact, let me. Can you see my screen?
Yep, I can bring that up.
Okay, so I'm quoting Encyclopedia Britannica. I'm quoting for you a school textbook. I am quoting from you several references that clearly point. I'm going to just pull up Encyclopedia Britannica over here. The Quran absolutely forbids any such beverage. The text over here about learning about it. This is from a school textbook. Learning about the religions of the world. It makes it very clear that the Quran forbids alcohol. Islam forbids alcohol. So my point is this: like, if anybody wants to come, because I've had this discussion before, and try to, I don't know if that's coming from my side or not. Oh, your side. One second.
Yeah. I
Sorry
accidentally
about
hit
that.
play on the
Yeah.
video, but
Oh, yeah. So if
it should
anybody
be
wants to
muted
come
now.
and say Islam allows alcohol, please get it peer reviewed. Please get it submitted to the right scholarship. And when they say, yeah, you know what, Islam allows alcohol to a certain extent, then I tell you what, I will retract my position, and all the publications I've shown you, they will retract their publications for this new reinterpretation. So please get it peer reviewed. That's what my stance on that is.
Yeah, so I think you may have misunderstood my point. Although you did raise a different issue that I didn't raise, and that's that some Muslims say that alcohol is allowed. But my point was actually, what is the history of alcohol? According to the standard Islamic position, if I am not mistaken, is that Allah allowed alcohol in the time of Jesus, allowed alcohol in the 6th century, allowed alcohol at the start of Muhammad's um, ministry or prophethood, whatever you want to call it. And then at one particular point decided this is the point in human history where it is no longer a good thing. So did Allah not care about kids getting fetal alcohol syndrome until the 7th century? Why did he put alcohol on the planet to begin with,
Sure.
for that matter?
Well, I think your question is, why was it even tolerated even to begin with? It should have just been outright condemned. So to answer to the answer to that question is, first of all, there was never a verse which says it's okay to drink alcohol. It was never like that. Rather, it was tolerated in the beginning. And I think that there's a difference between that. It was tolerated in the beginning because, again, we are talking about an addictive drug. Even from a scientific perspective, stopping cold turkey would be very difficult. But if you slowly wean them off of that drug, that is a much better approach. And so then finally, Allah said in the Quran, inside chapter 2, verse 219, and this is going to point out the second scientifically correct statement in the Quran, because we talked about interpretation, things like that. It says over in chapter 2, verse 19, they have some benefits for the people, but their harm is far greater than their benefit. So now let's see what science actually says about this. Now I'm quoting from you the CNN article, which you can look on my screen over here. It says many studies have shown that the overall health risk of drinking alcohol outweighs any benefits. Word for word agreement with modern science, no interpretation game needed. Let us read again what the Quran says. The harm far greater than the benefit. Science, overall health risk of alcohol outweighs any benefits. This is word for word agreement. No need for any kind of interpretation problem or any kind of issue here. So what the Quran does, it makes two scientifically correct statements on alcohol, while Jesus makes zero. So now that goes back to the question, wait a second, Muhammad is doing a fantastic job on this.
Well, okay, so you've now raised to 219, and this verse also talks about gambling. So if you're going to say that there is some kind of miraculous correspondence because you found a particular article that happened to use the same words, then where is your article that says the same thing about gambling? Because the Quran verse ties the two together. It says
Yes.
intoxicants and gambling.
And that, by the way, is a third scientifically correct statement, which there is a strong relationship between gambling addiction and alcohol addiction. In fact, what the scientists even say, most people who have gambling addictions also have alcohol addiction as well. So there's a powerful relationship between both of them. And as you've pointed out, it's mentioned in the Quran. So there's actually three correct, scientifically correct statements over there. But the point here is, I think what you're kind of backing away from is Muhammad did a fantastic job on addressing this drug of alcohol, while Jesus didn't. And that's
Well,
the question, which
we
I'm trying
haven't
to
talked
answer.
about the Bible yet, and
Okay.
I think that the biblical teaching and the Quranic teaching are actually very similar in this. We'll look at Bible verses here in just a second, but the verse you're quoting, 219, doesn't actually say that it causes harm. It says it's a sin. Again, it seems to be talking about your spiritual relationship, your relationship with God, that alcohol breaks your relationship with God. And it, to me, it's not talking about health at all. There might be so things that are sinful often do have health implications,
Mhm.
but I don't think that it's making a health statement. I think it's saying that it's sinful.
Mhm.
And guess what? The Bible says that drinking to excess is sinful as well.
Mhm. Well, okay, so the text does explicitly state that it does state that the harm is far greater than their benefit. But I think where you are going with this is just not going to help you, because what you're doing, you're going back to the and trying to interpret what the right stance of the Bible is on alcohol. But why is that futile? Because it all goes back to the study. The study did not show anything of value in terms of the biblical position on alcohol. It's irrelevant. The question is, how does this impact humanity? And the study actually said you need to go to the Christians to study fetal alcohol syndrome. And telling us, okay, well, here's how I'm interpreting the Bible, will not change the cold hard facts that at the end of the day, in terms of fetal alcohol syndrome, the Bible has zero to no impact on that,
Well,
in improving
as
their
I already
situation.
pointed out, as I already kind of pointed out once, the alcohol consumption is primarily cultural. You go to different Christian
Mhm.
countries, and there's vastly different levels of alcohol consumption. And if you look at different points in Islamic history, there's vastly different points of alcohol consumption. So you're just
Mhm.
taking one particular point in time and comparing it to one other particular place in Christendom, and you're using that as your example, but it doesn't seem to be universally true. There have been
Mhm.
times where Muslims consumed large amounts of alcohol. There are Christian countries which consume small amounts of alcohol. But I did want to point out once again that you're kind of adding your own words to the verse. What 219 says is, in them is great sin and benefit for people. You it said that the verse says there's a vast difference between the amount of sin and the benefit. It doesn't say that. You said it talked about harm and benefit. It doesn't say that. It says that there's great sin and benefit. So, and then it says the sin is greater than their benefit. It doesn't say far greater. It just says whatever benefit you get out of drinking, stop, because it's sinful and that is worse. And I can agree with that statement, but I don't think it's some kind of miraculous new knowledge. I think it's very similar to what the Bible says. So I'm just going to read a couple Bible verses, and then we can get to my other points, unless you have some response to them. So
Mhm.
Proverbs 21 says, wine is a mocker and beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise. Ephesians 5:18 says, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be
Mhm.
filled with the Spirit. Titus 2:3 says, likewise, teach the old women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. So we have multiple Bible
Mhm.
verses that are against the use of alcohol. There are many more that are specifically about, that are about drunkenness, the consequences of drunkenness. There are
Mhm.
verses that talk about being intoxicated. So it's mentioned many times in the Bible. And
Mhm.
just like in the Quran, where 1667 says, and from the fruits of the palm trees and grapevines you take intoxicant and good provision. Indeed, in that is a sign for a people who reason. So the Quran acknowledges that there are some benefits. In fact, the verse you quote acknowledges that there are some benefits, some nice aspects of alcohol, but overall, it's more harmful.
Mhm.
And that seems to be the position of the Bible as well.
Mhm. Okay. Well, let's just look at it from this position. Then let's just say the Bible condemns alcohol. Let's just go along with it. Although I know many people would agree, but at the end of the day, that's not going to matter because we are looking at things from a scientific perspective. Even let's just agree that the Bible condemned alcohol. If that's the case, well, it did a really miserable job of it because when we look at it from a scientific perspective, you see, Thaddeus, your mistake is you're looking at it from a religious perspective. But we need to look at things from a scientific perspective. Science has given zero how shall I say, zero credibility to the Bible or any zero recognition in anything related to alcohol to the Bible. So as if we were to look at the Quran and the Bible saying the same thing, Bible condemns alcohol, Quran condemns alcohol, we can still argue the same thing that, man, the Bible really did a really bad job of it. At least not as good as what Islam has done. Islam has been recognized by academia. And this is just one of the studies, by the way, which I'm sharing with you. And so we can still say Islam overall has provided the superior answer from a scientific perspective than the Bible. And even if we were to consider the Bible as claiming that alcohol is forbidden, so there's no way out of this conundrum. I mean, there's no way out of this question of asking well, how do you explain an alleged false prophet saving millions of children from fetal alcohol syndrome while the true Lord and Savior let them perish? And that was a question which I debated David Wood on back in my debate with him, and I guess Nabil Qureshi was there as well. And I asked him the same question and I hammered him with it. And the only answer he said, well, what about Aisha? That was his only response. And you can watch that debate. And that's the reason why I'm telling you he's running away, because he knows there's no good answer to that question. And all
Well,
we're looking at is
I've given the
alcohol.
good
Yeah.
I've given the good answer multiple times, and that's that the amount of alcohol consumption isn't really related to Islam. It's cultural, varies between different times and places, both in the Christian world and the Islamic world. Um, but let me press you on this. So this you may call this, what about Aisha? I'm not going to talk about Aisha, but you may think it's in the same line. But to me, it's actually about being consistent in your logic here.
Mhm.
So you're saying that in the today, in 2023, in the Islamic world, generally there's less alcohol consumption, and thus less fetal alcohol syndrome and any other side effects of alcohol consumption. All right? And that is factually correct, um, as you pointed out, scientific studies. Here's another thing that is factually correct. Today, in the Islamic world, incest is far more common than in Christian countries. And this actually seems to be fairly similar, that the Bible seems to the situation with alcohol, that the Bible uh, has some teachings on incest, including outlawing cousin marriage. And then Muhammad comes along and he corrects it and says that there's no problem with cousin marriage. And as a result, you have incest and the consequences of incest being more prevalent in the Islamic world. So now you have, let's see if you're consistent, right? So you say that the outcomes of alcohol in 2023 are evidence for Muhammad. Now you're going to say the outcomes of incest in 2023 are evidence against Muhammad.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. So do you want me to answer that real quick?
Yeah, yeah.
So I would just make it clear Jesus did not condemn cousin marriage. I mean, if you just basically Google cousin marriages in the Bible, you'll see that's actually permissible. But rather, this is a topic of scientific errors. This is and I'll answer you. And this is about being consistent. That does the Quran and Islam, cause same type of misery and suffering that the teachings of the Bible does. Now, there's many examples, which I just gave alcohol as one example, but the answer is no. Let me just first of all put the share my desktop and
Yep,
share
go
with
ahead.
you the proper understanding of what cousin marriage is, what scientists say about it, and what Islam says. First of all, the Quran and the Hadith does not encourage cousin marriage, but I have here an article which talks about. It says it's estimated that there's about 80% of marriages in human history have been between first or second cousins. And furthermore, in the following article, which I have over here, first I'm going to tell you what science says about it, then I'll tell you what Islam says about this. Um, and for cousin marriages was not only allowed. Okay, so cousin marriages. I'm just showing you cousin marriage was allowed in human history. Um, and here's the article I want to get in front of you. That at the end of the day, I don't know if it's going to really make a difference banning cousin marriages because of the following research articles. It says, I like your genes. People are more likely to choose a spouse with similar DNA. So the question is here, would it even matter in light of this scientific study to ban cousin marriage? Let's go to the next article, which what does science actually say about cousin marriages? Now, I'm quoting from you from the article of, I think this is from Stanford University. It says, while the chance may be increased, it isn't as high as most people think. Children of parents who are cousins or have siblings have a slightly higher risk of being born with disability. Now, that's taking into consideration that people are already marrying people who have similar DNA. So you got to also look at that factor in light of this. So that's what science says about cousin marriages. Now let's see what Prophet Muhammad has to say about who you should marry. Okay. It says a woman may be married for four reasons: for her property, her status, her beauty, and her religion. So try to get the one who is religious. May your hand be smeared with dust. So the encouragement here is, hey, listen, you need to, and merit and religion here is not just talking about your religion, but it's also talking about your character as well. I mean, it goes back to understanding the Arabic here, but the point here is, look, if you follow the divine guidance given by Prophet Muhammad, it would be very rare that you would marry your cousin. Remember the emphasis given here. May your hands be besmeared with dust, that you try to marry for some other reason other than what is given. And then the example given here is, do not marry women for their beauty, for it may lead to their doom. Do not marry for their wealth, for it may lead to the fall into sin. Rather, marry them for their religion. A black slave woman with piercings who is religious is better. So the encouragement here is actually interracial marriage, and he gave that as an example. So if you follow the prophetic example, there would never be any issue to begin with on cousin marriage.
Well, that's a very humorous statement there, Nadir, because it's obviously saying that even this highly culturally undesirable marriage is good if the person is religious. So to say that it's encouraging that as the best kind of marriage uh, is
Mhm.
very disingenuous.
Well, no. What I'm saying is look, if you give this to the general public, let's say you give it to the masses, how are they going to interpret it? They're going to argue, well, you know what? Hey, yeah, that woman's of a different race, and Muhammad recommended that as an example. So that certainly does, to a certain extent, encourage interracial marriage.
Well, it doesn't forbid it. Say that it encourages it is not an accurate treatment
I
of
would say
the
people
text.
would interpret it that way.
Uh, I don't think so. But that's not really important anyway. So the verses you quoted tell me that the best reason to marry someone is because they are of good religious character.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Now that has nothing to do with whether or not they are related to you.
No,
Your sister might be of great religious character. So that doesn't in any way contradict what I said.
no, it does.
Okay, how does it contradict it?
So what's happening in, like, let's just say Pakistan? People are marrying their cousins just because you are in my family and I want to keep the wealth in our family. If you follow this prophetic example, you're going to find a suitable mate outside of your family. People are not following this. Now, again, could this, if you follow the prophetic example, would it be sometimes that perfect character or that religious character would be in your cousin? It could happen, yes. But now you're talking about an acceptable frequency level, which the scientists would accept in terms of cousin marriage. Because remember, going back to the science, they're not saying it's wrong to do it, to marry your cousin, even to begin with. But it's where the scientific agreement is in the frequency of that occurrence happening, and that is scientifically correct.
Well, they're certainly not making a moral judgment, right? Because that's not what scientists do. However, I don't think that it is accurate to say that they would say there is no problem. The article you read simply said that it's not as dangerous as people believe, or you, in other words, you don't share as much genetic material in common, or the consequences. So most people have no clue why incest is bad to begin with. Incest is bad because it increases the prevalence of recessive genes. And
well, let me get you a better article if that one is not clear enough. So I'm quoting from the New York Times over here. This article right over here. This is by Dr. Arno Mutulski. It says the result is talking about cousin marriages and the risks, as you can see from the article. It says the result is still not considered large enough to discourage cousins from having children, said Dr. Arno, Professor Emeritus of Medicine and Genome Science at the University of Washington. I do have more examples of more references if you want to read those, we can, but I think that second reference should make it pretty clear. But I think where the issue here is in the frequency. Islam reduced the frequency to a very low level, and that is something which all the scientists can accept.
Well, I don't think it reduced it at all because it didn't discourage it in any way. But I think I have my answer, right? That you aren't going to be consistent, and you're debating how bad it is, but you're not debating that it's bad. So I can debate how bad alcohol is. Instead, I just simply agree that yes, it has detrimental effects. So you're not actually being consistent because you're saying in the case of alcohol, whatever number of cases of fetal alcohol syndrome exists, that is evidence for the truth of Islam. Then you go to
that's not
incest, you go into marrying cousins and say, oh, it's not that prevalent. It's low enough frequency that we're not super concerned about it. And then you say, well, if they're not concerned about it, then there's no difference. But let me just go to something completely different here from Marco. He says, can you press him on female circumcision? So female circumcision is widely practiced in Islamic countries today, universally agreed to be very detrimental to the female with no benefit. It's virtually unheard of outside the Islamic world. So is this, if you're going to be consistent and look at the outcomes, is this evidence against the prophethood of Muhammad?
Yeah, so I think the first misunderstanding I think everybody is having here is that, see, my initial argument was comparing the teachings of Jesus and Muhammad. I mean, they both spoke about alcohol, this drug. So, but the examples giving about female circumcision and cousins, I'm happy to have those discussions with you. But what I did notice is that you're not able to show the teachings that Jesus is teaching something on this, and therefore Jesus' teaching is better than Muhammad. So you're really not able to launch the same type of arguments which I am. Rather, we are now kind of moved into the issue of scientific error. And like I said, I'm happy to have that discussion, but I just wanted to kind of point out that one's distinction. So going back to circumcision over here, this is not something which is mentioned in the Quran. Number one, female circumcision, this is not something in Islam which says you have to do. So now this goes back to a cultural practice which some people have adopted. And the whole point is, what exactly is female circumcision here, which I'm against? Is it clitorectomy? God forbid. Clitorectomy, the complete removal of the clitoris. Is it hoodectomy? Hoodectomy is just an incision on the, I guess, on top of the, where there's like a hood on top of the clitoris, where you just kind of expose it to make it more prominent, so the clitoris can be more prominent, which, by the way, is a cosmetic surgery which many women do for sexual arousal, because now that the hood is exposed. What exactly is that procedure? I'd like to know. Where is that in the Quran and Hadith that you could show me that? But the point here is, this is clearly not something which Islam says you have to do or should do. Rather, people started interpreting things into our texts. So
Well,
I don't see that as any
but
kind of scientific error.
well, one, it's generally been agreed by Islamic scholars that it is mandated by the Sunnah of Muhammad.
Hodectomy or
I will,
clitorectomy? Which one?
well, just circumcision, which is undefined, right?
Yeah, we have to first find out which one they're referring to.
Well, if I do want to get back to the main subject here,
Sure.
but because we're now talking about hadith, we're not talking about the Quran, and Muhammad, at least in principle. You may or may not agree with this. Most Muslims probably won't agree with it, but Muhammad can be in error, and the Quran still be completely accurate, logically
Right.
speaking. So I don't want to push too much on it, but I do think that you are revealing a double standard here, though, because now you're saying it's cultural. Now you're saying people are misinterpreting it. But when I said that the Bible teaches that alcohol is bad and you shouldn't consume it, you said that, well, it didn't do a very good job of teaching that. Well, I can just say the same thing here. Muhammad didn't do a very good job of teaching what he meant by circumcision, because the complete removal or otherwise destruction of the clitoris is very common in at least African countries that are almost entirely Muslim. Other forms of circumcisions are practiced in virtually every Muslim country. So even if you're saying that it's not taught, right, or that they're misunderstanding what it means, your standard when it came to the Bible was to look at the outcomes. Now, when I'm looking at outcomes, you're telling me you have to go on the correct interpretation. So it's a different standard.
No, I think I don't think it's a different standard, because first of all, the issue, the main focus of my initial argument was about comparing the teachings of Jesus and Muhammad on a dangerous drug. Secondly, when I said look at the outcomes, you have to bring a scientific research paper, which would then say, look, this is that they're following the example of Muhammad, because Muhammad is the one who's teaching them. I was actually able to show that for you inside the research paper, which I showed, which said, listen, it's the Christians who have this problem, and there is something intrinsic about the Bible and the Quran here. But the issue is, I think all the scholars, from what I understand, they would never endorse clitorectomy. From an Islamic scholarly perspective, clitorectomy is absolutely forbidden. I think the only thing they would ever allow was hoodectomy, at least from my understanding. So I don't think there's any double standard there, and I don't think we could blame Muhammad for what's going on in the world, because even from a there are many people who misinterpret the Bible. There are many people who use the Bible in a wrong way. For that, I'm not blaming the Bible for that. That's their own ignorant understanding. Like, for example, the curse of Ham. That, of course, now this was prevalent amongst Christians, that they believe that black people were cursed. But is that really what the Bible teaches? No, it does not.
So I wasn't prepared. I don't have the references for female circumcision. It wasn't something I planned to talk about. So we'll just leave that there. I do have one super chat that I want to read before continuing on from Time is Fleeting.
I can't answer this question in a 20-minute interview, nor is it wise to do so, which is why I never brought this topic up myself. You will not find one lecture of mine about this issue. It should never be brought up in public. And I don't like these idiots, and they are idiots, wallahi. This is not something you discuss amongst the masses, ya akhi. It's not wise. I encourage anybody who is really interested to go deep to take the class. I do this class. It'll be 1 year later.
We'll see if whether this is a wise question to ask. Thank you for the donation. Time is fleeting. So he says, the dirty kafir tell me there's a scientific error in Surah 272. It says there are stones from which water bursts forth. Could the esteemed Sheikh Nadir locate these rivers for me? Has shaken me. So he's not actually, he's an ex-Muslim. He is not a Christian. And so he's having a little fun with it, saying that, pretending that he's a Muslim. But otherwise, legitimate question here. What would you say about that verse?
What verse is it?
272 says that stones, that water comes from stones. Or it specifically says that there are some stones from which rivers come from.
Surah 2, verse 72. Let me pull that up. That's okay. What it says in Surah 2, verse 72 is that this is the man was killed, and you disputed who the killer was, but Allah revealed what you concealed. So I don't see that in the Quran.
Yeah, that might not be the right verse.
Yeah, maybe you could find the right verse there.
Yeah. It might be the one before or after, since sometimes different versions have different numbering by one. Or he might have just had a typo. I don't know. So time is fleeting. If you could if you could give us the verse reference, we'll take a look. Otherwise, well, hard to address something that you don't see on your screen, right? Let me just 274. He says, and then he said sorry.
Surah 274. Let me go there real quick. Okay. Even your hearts became hardened like rocks, or even harder. For some rocks gush rivers, others split, spilling water, while others are humbled in awe of Allah. Well, for some rocks gush rivers. I'm not sure what that actually even means. Let me read this here. So let me see. Yet the farju from it rivers. I don't know. I would have to look into that. I'm not sure actually what the verse actually states there. So give me a little bit of time. And I'll
yeah, that's fair enough. You can give your response later in the comment section after you've had a chance to read it. And I'm sure there'll be people saying that you're running away or something.
Hey,
but I actually think that's I actually think that's the responsible thing to do, right? If you don't have an answer off the top of your head, instead of just making it up to say I need to research it. So I appreciate the honesty there, actually. So I did have one more thing on alcohol, and then I want to talk about the separation of the waters. So one of the things you said is that you want to look for things that are new, are unique to the Quran, aren't found in previous literature. So what would you say if I told you, and I can back this up, but we'll look at the specific sources in a meeting, but what would you say if I told you that it was well known in ancient Greek medicine long before the time of the Quran that alcohol was harmful?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would even say that there are people who have condemned alcohol as well, and in the past. But what we have in Islam are two scientifically correct statements. Nobody in the past has ever made two scientifically correct statements on alcohol. But the main issue here is, again, I repeat, it's about doing a better job than Jesus. And it goes back to that fundamental question, well, why would God, if he was Jesus, allow Muhammad to save, to obey? Well, why would a false prophet save millions of children from FAS while the true Lord and Savior would just let them perish? The only sensible explanation here is the Bible is in error and Muhammad is a true prophet and he gave a better and he corrected that scientific error. There really isn't any better understanding of that. That's the best explanation.
Well, I think that the best explanation is that Muhammad, or Allah, if you prefer, the author of the Quran, um, made a true statement that alcohol is harmful, but it was a well-known statement, one shared by the Bible. And yes, in the current culture of most of the Islamic world, not quite all of it, but most of it, alcohol is highly discouraged. And that is, could it be related? Sure,
Well,
it
we've already
could be.
debated this.
But right,
But
right,
see,
right.
Thaddeus,
So
remember, alcohol,
I don't.
alcohol is just the first thing. It's also there are other
Right, right.
issues as well where we find many corrections. So it's not just alcohol.
Right. So let me just real quick, since you already acknowledged these sources exist, let me just real quick, and it doesn't want to zoom in.
Also, I want to go back to the one verse, chapter 2, verse 72, if I may. I just read the verse. The text of the Quran actually doesn't say that water is gushing forth from split rocks. That's a false interpretation of the text. It just says for some rocks from it you're going to get some gushing rivers. Others split, and then and so I think he was misreading the text of the Quran.
Yeah, I'm not prepared to debate that verse. The first time that was proposed to me, I was like, as a scientific error, I was like, I don't know. That's such a strange thing to say that I'm not sure that's really what the Quran is saying. Although I will say that it is comparing the hardness of your hearts to rocks, which are a hard thing, and saying your hearts are even harder than rocks because some rocks gush forth water. So it does kind of seem to be saying that that rocks are in a way softer, which only makes sense if water actually does come from. So I don't know. I wouldn't go to it as like one of the top scientific errors, but at best it's imprecise language. Anyway, let's get back to the point at hand here, which is what the Greeks said. So this is from Galen, writing in the 1st century AD. Wine is more praiseworthy for health than any other thing. However, anyone who drinks it must be wise if he does not wish to suffer some irreparable ill. For wine can encourage heat, fill the body with strength, and digest food from all parts. And there is no wine that is not harmful, so as to not produce these effects. But it has, as all other things, some inferior qualities and some superior qualities. Wine can also give pleasure to the soul in a certain state, since it is a remedy against grief, and in my opinion, it is what Helen poured into the crater. So he says all wine is harmful, right? He said there is not any type of wine which is not harmful. But he says that it has some benefits and some harmful aspects, which, as you pointed out, when the Quran says that is a scientifically accurate statement. So why is it miraculous, or at least somewhat good evidence when the Quran says it, but it doesn't mean anything when Callan says it?
Well, so no, no one is saying, look, the Quran is right. The Quran is a miracle because it got the right answer on alcohol. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Muhammad did a better job of answering the question of alcohol than Jesus himself. And that it goes back to the question, well, why is that? If Jesus was God, why would we see this that Muhammad is giving superior answers? But the point which I also want to make, it's not just alcohol. It's many examples of how I can show you that Muhammad is giving scientifically superior answers than Jesus himself. That's my point.
All right. I think that, why we don't agree, I think that we've pretty much covered the territory. I don't want to dwell on alcohol forever. I did want to look at the statement about separation of waters, because it was brought up. I think you brought it up as your
Can you
first
just give me 1
example.
second here?
Yep.
We've got a problem with the air conditioning in this house. I just got to turn on the fan. Just give me 1 second. Because I'm in Florida, and you know how hot it gets over here. Just give me 1 minute here.
Yeah, no problem. So Logician Bowen said harm of banning tiny percent of alcohol diluted in water would have been higher, Nadir. Today we have good water filtration. They didn't have that in times of the Bible or Muhammad. Muhammad is worse. And then he pointed to 1 Timothy 5:23. Stop drinking only water. Use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. It is an observable fact in Paul's time that a
Okay,
little
I'm sorry about
alcohol
that. Go ahead.
avoided sickness. So I just read a couple comments
Mhm.
from the audience, and the general principle is that it's not an obvious good to forbid alcohol in the time of Muhammad. They talked about um, kind of its antibacterial properties, which is debatable whether alcohol would actually stop. No, alcohol clearly has antibacterial properties,
Mhm.
but in the quantity it's contained in drinking, whether it would actually be beneficial to the water, uh, while a common belief is somewhat uh, debatable scientifically speaking. However, there are other clear benefits. It's a primary painkiller, for example, which is really important. So to me, I agree with the gist of this statement that it's not obvious that it's obvious in the modern times that alcohol doesn't have that speaking from a strictly physical health standpoint, alcohol is more harmful than good. But
Mhm.
that even on just a strictly physical standpoint, that doesn't necessarily apply to all history, which is interesting because Allah didn't forbid it until the time of Muhammad, and he didn't forbid it until partway through Muhammad's career.
Well,
So apparently, to even to Allah, alcohol had benefit. So I don't see how it's wrong for Jesus not to, even if you're correct that there is no uh, that Muhammad's teaching is superior for today, supposedly,
mhm.
uh, that there's something wrong with Jesus not forbidding alcohol in his own time when it's arguable that alcohol was a net benefit to society, even physically.
Well, let's look at another example. I think we've done enough on
Yeah.
alcohol. The,
We were
you
about
know,
to move on, so you don't need
yeah.
to respond to that. I
Oh,
was
by the
just
way,
reading a
can I
couple
share
of
my
comments
desktop?
until then.
If you, I just want to show something here.
Uh,
So while I was accusing everybody of being ignorant and stuff like that, so I'm also ignorant myself of that one argument which the guy was raising, and so he raised chapter 2 verse 72. So I was actually just googling it because I don't know myself. And so science experiment with rocks that absorb water. So it looks like this is all new to me, by the way. It looks like rocks actually do absorb water. But I'll do some more research on this. But I think the lesson here is we're all a little bit ignorant and we all need to learn. But I wanted to show you just, I mean, when we talk about alcohol, it is it is not just alcohol. It's other corrections that we find in Islam. Like for example, let me just give you another one. On the question of meat consumption. In fact, what we look, in fact, where's my little Oh, can you guys see my screen? Oh, you guys can see it. Okay, good. I think I'm over here. Yeah. So, um, yeah, I'm sorry. Here's my little presentation. I'm so lost over here. So, actually, no, that's not it as well. Okay, well, while I find my notes, I will talk at the same time. So, Jesus, of course, he allowed for meat to be consumed, and there's no basically removed all restrictions on meat consumption. Prophet Muhammad, but this is a big problem because we know that Christians, I mean, we know that now because of eating certain type of meats, um, it could cause, it can lead to something known as zoonotic diseases, which are basically diseases which are spread from eating monkeys and bats. And that's how we got AIDS. That's how we got Ebola. That's how we got COVID. Most likely COVID, because they basically originate from these animals. Well, Prophet Muhammad corrects this wrong understanding of Jesus by just letting anybody eat any kind of meat they want and gave the scientifically correct statement where he forbade, here, let me share my desktop. He forbade the consumption of meats, like for example, monkeys, any animals which has fangs. So there you have it, a clear. In fact, let me share my desktop over here real quick over here. Here we go. Though. Here we go. I got the verse which talks about which talks about removing their consumption. Here's the science behind that. Let me just get to the actual hadith of Prophet Muhammad, because he now gives you the cure for Ebola and AIDS and all these things. It says Allah's messenger forbade the eating of meats of beasts having fangs. So here we see yet a second, revision or correction or whatever you want to call it, but what is indisputable, but when it comes to meat consumption, Muhammad once again gives a scientifically superior answer than Jesus himself on this topic.
So we are talking. The subject of this video is supposed to be scientific miracles in the Quran. You're now going to hadith. So instead of rehashing our discussion on this, I'll just refer people to the previous discussion on this hadith, because we did discuss this hadith for probably more than an hour when I invited you on to discuss science in the Quran, or science in Islam. I mean, what the mark of Muhammad being a true prophet. I don't remember exactly the title of the video. I apologize. Or I tell the exact title. But basically, I invited you to give your arguments for Islam, and this is one of the arguments you presented.
Yes.
And so we already discussed this particular hadith for some time. So I'll just refer people to that discussion. Some quick summary from my perspective, and then Nadir can give a quick summary from his perspective. From my perspective, this is clearly a cherry-picked example. There is debate within Islam what animals qualify as having fangs, and zoonotic diseases are carried by all animals, not just the particular ones that Nadir wants to point to. Cattle actually seem to be the animal that carry the most disease, and this wasn't forbid by either Christianity or Islam, so I don't think it's a good argument.
But the question is, does science forbid eating cattle? Is science okay with eating other animals, which you could potentially, like chicken, you could potentially get, and pork, you could potentially get diseases from them as well. Science is perfectly fine with that. But the question here is, should Islam now give you the cure for all these other diseases and maladies, for diabetes? No. You do find an agreement between science and Islam. Our right position is now, okay, what about camels and Mars, or I'm sorry, the diseases which come from camels and all that? Why didn't you give us the answer for that? No, the right answer and a right response to this is we should be thankful and grateful that at least we got this, because God is under no obligation to give you the cures for all these other diseases out there. But my point here is it's really not refuting you, Thaddeus. It's refuting Hamza Tzortzis. It's refuting Ali Dawah. I have respect for them, but let's face it, there's a lot which can be said, which should have been said, which they're not saying. And it seems like they are just ignorant. And again, I'm ignorant myself as well on a lot of things, as you just saw. It seems like we are all kind of ignorant of this topic, and we need to educate ourselves on Quran and science properly, and not go out there and make these type of bold statements. Oh, that's Quran and science is all nonsense and things like that, which can be used by people like you and and other people who are our opponents to be used against our religion. I think that's the point I'm trying to reach. I'm trying to send home to everybody.
Yeah. So just quickly, you said that science is quote unquote fine with eating animals that people normally eat, and that's just, it has nothing to do with the nature of those animals. It's just because we already eat them, so we're already exposed to their diseases, so they wouldn't be new diseases. It doesn't really have anything to do with those animals being inherently superior or something like that. I'll just give you a chance to respond to this, because I'm sure you know that.
Again, the issue here is Muhammad is giving better answers on meat consumption than Jesus. So alcohol is not the only one. And now we can show many examples of this where Muhammad is coming forward. And this is an alleged false prophet. Why would an alleged false prophet give you the cure for AIDS, Ebola, and COVID?
I don't want to rehash the whole discussion, but as we discussed before, there's no evidence that any of those things came from eating animals. They people might have been exposed in various different ways. No one knows the exact origin of them, and so on and so forth. But just one other thing before I do want to talk about the the barrier in the sea, since that was brought up at the beginning. But one other thing on food, and I'll just give you a chance to respond, because I'm sure this, you know that someone's going to bring this up, right? So Muhammad said to drink camel urine if you have a stomach ache, and alcohol is also promised as a benefit in heaven. So how do you reconcile these seemingly idiotic teachings like drinking camel urine to cure your stomach ache, and the inconsistency of alcohol being somehow becoming good when you go to heaven? How do you address these kinds of things? Because if you're going to say, even if your examples are correct, we need to look at the total body of evidence and decide whether it's a couple cherry-picked examples or it's actually a pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here we see, a classic example of why Islam is the true religion. As I pointed out, Christianity is an interpretation-based religion. All they're going to do is falsely interpret texts. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to hit you with facts, okay? Because Islam is a fact-based religion. So here we see it is a double-barrel interpretation spin. What do I mean by that? It is a misinterpretation of the science. It is a misinterpretation of what Muhammad actually said. And he's spinning both these interpretations to create some kind of error. So let's start from the very top. Let's start from the hadith and show you how he misinterpreted the hadith itself, and then we'll show you how he misinterpreted science. So it did not say in the text, drink camel urine for your stomach ache. Okay, that is clearly not in the text. Rather, what it says over here, it said that these people came to the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so I guess they were sick to some extent. And now here's a text which he ignored. It says, so they did so, and after that they recovered from their ailments and became healthy. So here they were sick. It was used as medicinal purposes. I want to make it very clear over here. And the part where they became better was completely ignored, and it said some tummy ache or some nonsense like that. So that is a misrepresentation of our actual scripture, what it actually said.
Well,
but let's get to science.
Well, well, first of all, I mean, you're disputing some of the details here, right? Yeah.
Well, you should quote it.
But you actually affirmed the important part, that Muhammad says that this is a medicine.
Yeah.
And that will make you better. So let's go.
It didn't say it will make you better.
That facts that camel urine will cure your illnesses?
Yeah, so let me get to the science part in just a second here. But the text didn't say that Muhammad is telling you that the camel urine will make you better. The text actually said they did become better from drinking this. So
right, yeah. So Muhammad prescribes it, and then they get better. Yeah, what is the logical conclusion of that? That what Muhammad prescribed was the cause of them getting better.
Yeah. So here's some articles, and this goes back to, living in the desert where water is scarce to begin with. How do people in desert survival, how do they survive when there's actually no water at all? So from the following article, it says over here, the yellow liquid diet. Is it a good idea to drink urine when water is scarce? It says over here, a healthy person's urine is about 95% water and sterile. So in short terms, it is safe to drink and does not replenish lost water. Now, let me give you another article on this subject over here. It's actually a person, which I can't find right now, but a person who was stuck like under a building or something. Yeah, here we go. A student drinks urine to survive 5 days locked in solitary confinement without food, water, or toilet. And I have here the actual interview of that student. So in a survival situation, yes, if you're in a desperate situation like this, and that is the only, liquid out there, you can definitely drink it. As I said, it is 95% water. So what's important here, I think the misrepresentation being made here is that, it is for that this is just something you should just drink, like, casually or something like that. That is clearly not the case. There were no Walgreens back then. This was truly their only way to basically give medicinal,
Yeah,
remedies
yeah.
to people.
So you called it the interpretation game when it comes to Christianity, but what you just did is definitely an interpretation game, because this hadith is not remotely about if you have no access to water, is it safe to drink
Hmm.
urine or not? I don't know if this is the same version as what you called up, so it might be worded differently, but this is in Sahih Bukhari
Hmm.
5687. It
Yeah.
says the climate of Medina did not suit some people, so the Prophet ordered them to follow his shepherd, i.e., his camels, and drink their milk and urine. And then the translator adds, as a medicine, for clarification. So they followed the shepherd, that is the camels, and drank their
Hmm.
milk and urine until their bodies became healthy.
Right.
Then they killed the shepherd, and so on and so forth. Uh, so this is clearly not about we have no water, we need to drink urine. This is clearly about something. Uh, Maybe it's a stomach ache, like was proposed. Maybe it's some other thing, but something about living in Medina doesn't
Hmm.
sit well with these people. So Muhammad tells them to go get some camel
Hmm.
urine and mix it with camel milk, and then drink it as a medicine. So it doesn't have anything to do with what you just said. So I'm going to ask again: Is this a good medicine or not?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think it's. I don't think there's any interpretation game being played over here. It's stated very clearly that until they became healthy. So we know from the hadith that it did cure them of whatever malady. Now I'm just guessing it's dehydration, based on that climate. Now you say, okay, well, you're just interpreting that. Well, okay, but it's a very good assumption. I've also showed you from science that people did drink urine to survive. That one guy went for 5 days, basically without any kind of water or food, and he lived off of his urine. So we do see that from that perspective, it's okay. But I think what's important here is from the text, which was what cannot be denied, is these people were sick to a certain extent, and we don't. But the text doesn't say what that ailment was, but the text does say that whatever the remedy was given to them, it cured them and they became healthy, and therefore it can never be a scientific error, because back then, what are you going to give people when they're sick, which we don't even know what the sickness is to begin with? So it's a mute point to even discuss that because of those holes which we can't
Well,
really fill.
you would have been better off not going to the dehydration thing, which
Okay.
was someone drinking their own urine, by the way, not that of an animal. Um, because obviously, if you have no liquid, you're going to die. So it doesn't matter how harmful the liquid otherwise is, as long as it doesn't dehydrate you, like salt water, then it's obviously going to be of some benefit if you're dehydrated and on the verge of dying of lack of water,
Hmm.
including alcohol, by the way, would be of some
Sure.
benefit in that situation.
Yes.
That isn't the question. The question is, you're asserting that Muhammad has these medical advice, these medical treatments,
Hmm.
and here he's explicitly giving it as medical advice. And now you're saying, well, we don't know what situation he was giving that, so we can't follow it. Well, science hasn't found any circumstance where urine was beneficial to people to take,
Hmm.
and there are scientific studies on this because it does happen in the Islamic world. People
Hmm.
follow the Sunnah of Muhammad. You can say they're misinterpreting it because they don't know how to use it properly, whatever, but they do follow it, and as a result, there are scientific studies on whether it's beneficial or not.
Hmm.
And here's just one particular study as an example, uh, and it's sorry, I should have highlighted the sentence before. None of the patients who continued to use camel urine showed any clinical benefit. And then it says all the patients believed that camel urine was a religious treatment. So they believed it would work,
Hmm.
and it didn't work, right?
Yeah.
So because of the advice of Muhammad, they were drinking camel urine
Hmm.
to cure their illnesses. So that this particular study decided to use it. In this case, it
Hmm.
was for cancer, but there are other studies on other
Hmm.
illnesses,
Hmm. Yeah.
which is inconsistent, right?
Well.
Uh, Now, if you're going to say, you personally wouldn't say this, but if a different Muslim said, uh, Muhammad was mistaken, it wasn't great advice, I'd be fine with that. we have to be consistent. So if we don't have any evidence that this is good advice, and we don't, other than the hadith itself declaring that they got better,
Yeah.
Which is, could be a coincidence, or it could just be made up, then maybe they didn't get better. And
Okay.
so I can't count the hadith as evidence for the truth of the teaching of the hadith. That would be ridiculous, because anyone could write that their own treatment worked. So if we don't have any outside evidence, then this counters, counts as evidence against your example. Now,
No.
I'm not saying it completely invalidates it, just like you say that you should look at the total of the evidence and
Sure.
not say that, go to one particular thing and say this is absolute proof. Likewise, I wouldn't say this is absolute proof of the falsity of Islam, but when you're weighing evidence, I think you need to look at the negative evidence as well.
Well, actually, this could never even constitute as negative evidence, because the text does say they became better, which you started denying. And so again, and we don't even know what the malady was. What was the illness that they were suffering from? So that destroys the entire argument. But there's also more problems here. And the first problem is they're not able to go to the Quran and show scientific errors. They're not able to show how the Bible is
right. And the only reason I brought this up in
Yeah.
the first place is because you went to a hadith,
Yeah.
right? You went to a hadith
Okay.
for the eating of
And
food.
also, one more point which I want to make. Remember, there are also a hadith which said, "Hey, listen, where Muhammad was actually giving advice was science which he learned from the Greeks and the Persians." And so, in fact, part of Islamic Sunnah is to learn and study science. Okay, so and in some cases that science could be right, some cases that could be wrong. So you just can't say, look, Muhammad is making this claim right here. No, he's also teaching you science of that particular era. And so that's why using a hadith like that could never really disprove the prophethood of Muhammad. He's not even close. But I think
Okay.
but we could always have a debate on the scientific miracles of is the Quran
There's-
scientifically accurate?
Yeah,
We-
yeah,
we-
that would be a different
we could
debate.
debate that,
And that's fair. As Nina said here, how does the know he got better from the camel urine and not the milk, right? Because Muhammad prescribed both of those. Or how do you know he didn't get better from natural causes? I mean, normally people do get better from illnesses, right? And usually you don't get an illness and it lasts for the rest of your life. So normally people do get better. So the mere fact they get better, even assuming the hadith is true, certainly can't count as evidence for it. And I don't see how it would invalidate the fact that we have no evidence of this being true in general.
Yeah.
But let's go ahead and get back to the Quran, because I do want to. I did tell Nadir that it would be between 2 and 3 hours, and we're over 2.
Oh, yeah.
So I do want to at least take some look at the seawater, or the barriers of the sea. So I'm going to go. Well, hold on 1 second here. So I got to rearrange my screen, because I have a PowerPoint presentation, and then it covered up our stuff. So then I couldn't see what was going on. So let me just move this over here. All right, cool. So this is one of the scientific miracles that I've talked on in some detail in the past. So let me just bring up my slides on it so that we have, so that we know what we are talking about. So what I have here on this screen is a particular claim from a particular Muslim. May not be the exact same claim as Nadir, but I won't read through the claim because it's not really relevant to what I want to discuss. But we see the verse here, right? One of a couple examples of it in the Quran. Surah 55, 19 and 20. He released the two seas meeting, and then the translator adds side by side. Between them is a barrier, neither of them transgresses. So clear enough, right? That this is talking about some sort of barrier. Let's see. So that this is, here's the other relevant verse, 25:53. And it's he who released the two seas, one fresh and sweet and one salty and bitter, and he placed between them a barrier and prohibiting partition. So that's just the verse. So my criteria that I outlined earlier is what these slides are going to be. So is it true? Now, I'm going to suggest that it isn't even really true, at least not the way this particular Muslim phrased it, because there isn't a fixed barrier in the ocean that waters can't transgress, which is what the Quran says, is that there's some kind of fixed barrier that they can't transgress. Now, if the barriers land or some of the other possibilities offered by the tafsir, sure, that could be true. But I don't think that is really true that there is a barrier in the sea. Now, this particular Muslim, they cited the where the Mediterranean Sea meets the Atlantic Ocean. And there's a common viral picture, which is what was shown on this, saying that this supposedly is a picture of the barrier that the Quran talks about, but this is actually just glacial runoff entering into the ocean. And the color difference is due to the fresh water meeting, well, the salty water. But the problem is they're mixing, right? They are mixing, and the barrier is constantly changing. So it doesn't seem to be something that that picture is definitely not support of this. Using that picture is definite fraud of anyone who does that. And then the claim is that the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean don't mix with one another, which that is on this slide, is also false. So how would you rephrase it to at least make it true?
Yeah, I think your question is, okay, so there's the Quran is claiming that there's a barrier which doesn't allow mixing, and that type of barrier doesn't exist. Is that your contention?
Well, yeah. So I'm responding to a particular Muslim, but that does seem to be what the verse says. That neither of them transgresses the barrier. They don't mix. There's a barrier, and the water on the one side of the barrier doesn't go over the barrier, so the water on the other side doesn't go over. There's no mixing. That seems to be what the verse is saying to me. And that seems to also be what 2553 was when it says he placed between them a barrier and prohibiting partition. So there's a partition that separates the two seas, the fresh water and the salt water, and prevents them from mixing with one another. So if you're claiming this verse means something different than there's an absolute partition, then I guess I need you to explain what you think the verse means and why.
Okay, well, the verse. Let me first go to the verse which I was referring to. That was chapter 55, verse 19. In fact, could you? I'm going to share my desktop real quick.
Yep. I can bring it. No problem.
So the Quran verse which I was actually quoting says nothing about mixing. Okay, it says over here that the Quran that it says over here, and I'm showing first what NASA is saying, that the picnic line is the name of this barrier which acts as a barrier which is in the sea. The Quran is talking about that there is a barrier, and then people start interpreting this word yabaghiyan to refer that this is actually talking about la yabaghiyan, that is actually talking about mixing, but that's not what the word means. Okay, so first of all, I also want to point out that the actual picnic line is invisible. You can't see it with the naked eye. But let me get to you the actual meaning of the word. Okay. This word, if you go to the root word, I'll just call it BGY. BGY is a root. That has never been referred in the Quran or in anywhere. Even today, they still use this word, by the way. It has never been referred to as mixing. It means transgress in the sense that they do not violate the laws of God. The laws which God has laid out, they do not violate that. You'll see that usage of the word inside chapter I forgot the verse over here, but I'll get you the verse number. It says, "O sister of Aaron, your father was not an evil man, nor your mother was a whore." Now, what word is being used now? You got the same word, BGY, one who transgresses the laws of God in terms of sexual immorality. So here we see the usage of the word. The transgress here should not be interpreted as mixing, but rather the one who transgresses against the laws of which God has laid out. and I'll get you that verse, which I forgot the number in just a second over here. Let me Google that. I'll get you the verse number.
No problem. I looked it up myself, and I can see that the vast majority of the usages seem to refer to moral laws. So
Yeah.
I think that that is a correct interpretation of the general, or a correct statement about the general usage of the term, which would be consistent with translating as transgress, and that is, by the way, the same verse that I had up there to begin with, one of the two verses. But what does it mean for there to be a barrier that can't be violated, right? Uh, what is it, what is a barrier, in other words? Um, if it's not a separator between two things, and violating that barrier, you referred to natural laws, would seem to be involve mixing, that the water from one side goes into the other side, and that seems to be what it's saying is the case, because otherwise the verse doesn't, I mean, I don't know what the meaning has. It is, if between two bodies of water, two inanimate objects, there's a barrier that has some sort of moral principle that these two seas can't violate.
So you're talking about the verse which I'm quoting, chapter 55, verse 19?
Yeah, that is the
Well, this goes back to, remember we were talking about interpret. Now, Ali Dawah made the point of people were interpreting science into the Quran to make it agree with science. Well, that is wrong, but is also equally as wrong as to interpret science into the Quran to make it disagree with the with science. Look, if the
well, so
Quran,
to be clear, I don't think the verse
yeah,
is a scientific error. I don't think that it's a scientific error. I
okay.
think it's just referring to land, and that it's referring to Allah's wisdom to separate the fresh water, which is useful for human beings, and the salt water, which is not, into separate places, so that they wouldn't have, this mix where it's kind of half salty, which is also useless. I think that's all it's talking about. So I don't think it's an error. I just don't think there's any special knowledge involved here.
No, well, the problem is we again, what you're saying is a very likely possibility that maybe the intent of the author was meant to refer to islands. That's possible. That's one of the many possible interpretations. But then, how would you explain that that it also agree with science as well? So for that, we would have to chalk it up as C under cops. C stands for coincidence. So, like I said, on every verse, we're going to call the cops. Just because you see some agreement with science doesn't make it an automatic scientific miracle. So if this is specific, if this was really referring to barriers, and that's the interpretation we're going to go with, okay, then we can chalk up the agreement, the other alternative interpretation, as a coincidence.
So would you say that this, so what would you say the barrier is, without using the word, pecnocline? What do you think that the barrier is, like, in terms of description? Like, is it fixed? Is it something that there's
What
like
type of
minimal
barrier?
mixing between? I mean, how are you describing it?
See, the type of barrier is not explicitly stated in the text. So I would reserve any kind of judgment on that. Now, the Quran explicitly said that this barrier does not allow any kind of mixing or anything like that. Okay, then I can entertain that discussion, but it doesn't state that. People are just interpreting things into the text, and we shouldn't be doing that.
Well, in the in 2553, right, which is talking about this, it seems to be talking about the same thing, because it says he released the two seas. It doesn't say, and this is where Muslims often fail, right? They think that it's talking about many different barriers between many different bodies of water, but Allah seems to say there are precisely two seas that there is a barrier between. So then when you go to 2553, he released the two seas, and the same exact language. It tells you one's fresh and one's sweet, and placed a barrier between them and a prohibiting partition. So it, to me, the natural interpretation of the text is that these two bodies of water, or these two types of water, more accurately, they don't mix with one another because there's something preventing them from mixing, and And the reason, which you only get from the surrounding context, but the reason why the Quran is declaring this is because it's talking about various things that are easily observed, but reflect the wisdom of God. And it's talking, it's talking about his wisdom to separate the useful fresh water and the useless salty water.
So, yeah, so now we've jumped to chapter 25, verse 53, which explicitly talks about salt and fresh water. The verse which I quoted did not talk about that. So these can be talking about, Surah 55, verse 19 could be talking about two different bodies of water. This could be talking about two different bodies of water. So we have a total of 4 different bodies of water. But what I would say from here is, okay, there is a barrier between them and a prohibiting partition, but it never talked about what's being prohibited. So the point which I'm saying, let's not interpret into the text what's not there. It just talks about something is being prohibited. What that is, it never actually stated what it was. So, I think it's very important not to interpret into the text what you think that could be.
Well, but to declare that it's some kind of advanced knowledge, you kind of do have to do that.
No.
You have to interpret
I'm not
that
claiming
into the
that.
text. Well,
So
you're
we
claiming it
never
as
claim that,
evidence,
yeah.
though. So
So-
you're saying it's only one possible interpretation.
That
I
was a
acknowledge
mistake
that.
Ali Dawah was making. So Ali Dawah was, and all these people, they're looking at the scientific verses and saying this verse is stating this scientific fact. But we should never do that, because what if science changes? There are also issues of multiple interpretations. So what the right approach here is okay, look, we found this one verse in the Quran, chapter 55, verse 19, where if you look at the different ways it can be rationally and legitimately interpreted, one of those do agree with modern science. Now, I'm not going to positively assert that's the right interpretation. No, that's where we pull back and say, hey, you know what? If that's not the right interpretation, then that would be a pretty amazing coincidence. And yeah, coincidence can explain chapter 55, verse 19. Then we move on to the next one. And we say, oh, hey, look, we find the same unusual phenomenon occurring again. And then we're finally going to get to a point where, okay, what's going on here? We can't explain this naturally, this unusual phenomenon.
Well, I don't think it's a coincidence at all, because I think the obvious interpretation in the verse, and I'll pull up the tafsir in a second because they agree with me. The obvious interpretation is that there is a physical barrier, which may well be dry land, that separates the two seas. But I think that you would grant that that's one possible interpretation, and you'd say that, well, there's this additional, more interesting interpretation, and that seems kind of odd. So maybe it's just a coincidence in this one case, but I think that the interpretation is actually impossible when you actually understand what a pecnocline is, because it's not something that's constant. It's a phenomenon that develops, and then that acts as some sort of semi-permeable barrier for a period of time, and then it dissipates and moves to a new location. So it doesn't seem to correspond to what is being described here at all to me.
I don't see anything in the Quran which says that the barrier can disappear and reappear. I don't think there's any denial or affirmation of that fact. So I think it's okay.
Well, it says that Allah placed a barrier, though, right? Doesn't it?
It could disappear. It could reappear.
I think that you're getting so far off the plain meaning of the text that your interpretation is becoming so stressed that it can't really be used as evidence. But let me go ahead and just quickly look at the other criteria, because you more or less agreed with the other criteria as well. So this was just me talking about whether it was true or not. So then here's what the tafsir say, right? So Ibn Kathir says quite plainly that the barrier is referring to dry land. That's all he says about it. He doesn't offer any other interpretation. Al-Tabari and Al-Qurtubi offer the same options. They say that it could be the dry land, or it can be the separation between the sky and land. So they're thinking that there is a barrier in the sky that keeps the water of space out. Or they could say it could be completely metaphorical, and it's referring to different types of people who are amenable to the message of Islam and people who are not, salty and sweet people. And so those are the three interpretations that the best ancient tafsirs offer on this. And the only one of those, if it's metaphorical, obviously, then it's not making a scientific statement at all. If it's talking about skies and lands, then that's plainly false, because even though many ancient people thought there was water in space, that's not true. And if it's talking about dry land, well, then that's just an easily observable fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what I would say to that is, since the fact that the Quran actually is agreeing word for word with modern science, add that to the list of possible interpretations. So again, at this point, we never say, look, the Quran is referring to the scientific fact. It's just that we add the scientific agreement to the list of valid possible interpretations that it could possibly mean. Maybe it is referring to the picnic line. And so now you got three beautiful interpretations up there, which is very possible. Just add the fourth one is all I'm asking.
Well, one, I don't think it's word for word. I think it would be at best a very poor description of the scientific phenomenon that you're referring to. And if it's only 1 out of 4, then that kind of decreases it, right? This is one of the points that Hamza Tzortsis was making, is that when you find out that there's other explanations, then the miracle becomes much less powerful, and it's not very good evidence. That doesn't mean it's like totally worthless, but it makes it much less meaningful, and which then means you need a lot more than just a couple examples to pile up.
Absolutely. I agree with that. I mean, you cannot just look at the sea barrier thing and say, there, the Quran's a scientific miracle based on one occurrence. Cops can explain it all away. But now there's actually, for example, an even more clearer example of agreement with science, and that is gender determination. It talked about the semen is what that the male and the female comes from the semen, which is scientifically correct. So now we move on to the next example, and we're going to find the same situation where, okay, well, that's one interpretation, but let's list some more. And what we are pointing out is this is an unusual phenomenon that when we list out the valid interpretations, one of them is that it does agree with modern science, and it happens again and again and again. And that's where we are saying we can't find a human explanation for why we find this unusual phenomenon occurring all the time inside the the Quran. So it's the miracle is in the frequency of this, not the individual occurrence.
Well, I could agree with that principle. The problem is when we look at every single instance that I've ever looked at, it quickly breaks down and becomes, pretty meaningless, or in some cases just outright wrong.
We can look at
when you look at those particular verses,
Mm-hmm.
and everything seems to, tellingly, everything seems to be a well-accepted belief in the 7th century that the Quran says. Whether or not it's correct, some of the things are correct. I'm not saying that everything it says is wrong, just that none of them seem to be like, great new knowledge.
Well, I can show you one if you like.
Well, let me just really quickly go through the other possibilities here, because I think there are a couple more possibilities for this one, that multiple of the cups, right? It wouldn't have to be a coincidence, because I think it is actually observable. Even if you're talking about the picnic line, yes, there's no like super obvious visual clue, but sailors are very attuned to what's going on in the water underneath them, and they can observe it. And I have had people who work as sailors tell me that that is true, that it can be observed from a ship.
A picnic line?
And also, it's not original to the Quran. This is an idea that was commonly known. Here are some examples of it. I'll just use Pliny as an example. In fact, the nature of water also is not deficient in marvels. Patches of fresh water float on the surface of the sea, being doubtlessly lighter. So Pliny is observing, just with his eyes, that fresh and salt water resist mixing to a degree, that there is some sort of quote unquote barrier between them. So I think that this is going to generally.
You're interpreting that into Pliny's works, right? I mean, he didn't explicitly say there's a barrier in them.
Correct, but it's the same idea. So I mean, if you prefer, it's quite literally stated in the book of Acts. But striking what in the Greek is literally a place between two seas. They ran the vessel aground, the bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was broken by the sea. So the book of Acts says that this is talking about when Luke and Paul and other of his companions are traveling on the sea, that they encounter a barrier in the sea. It quite literally says that.
Can you
not visible from the
scroll up a
surface.
little bit? I can't see the verse.
Oh,
Can you
yeah.
Yeah, just scroll up a little bit.
I'll do this. There you go.
Okay, thanks. Wonderful. But let's see. The cat's in my way.
Yeah, ignore the cat.
They ran the
sure, because the
vessel
cat at
aground.
a bad time. Come on, people.
The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broke. I don't see anything about seas having barriers.
Well, okay, so what's translated as reef is literally a place between two seas. That's what it says.
But
So the
reef.
translation's interpreting that they ran aground on a reef, which is no doubt what is being described. But it literally says striking a place between two seas.
I just think it's a lot of interpretation is needed in that. It's like a post hoc rationalization.
Well, I'm not suggesting the Quran copied this verse of the Book of Acts. What I am suggesting is that there are multiple natural explanations why someone would say that.
Yeah, I would agree. We can call the sea. We call the cops on every one of them. You're just giving us examples of cops, of different coincidences that could take place, or maybe there's some plagiarism involved. All of that, maybe it was observed. All of that is hypothetically possible at this point of the game. We can't rule those out. Yeah, that's what cops is there for. Cops is doing the homework for you, Thaddeus, so that you don't have to do that.
Well, I mean, I independently basically came up with the same criteria as you, right? They were basically the same ideas. I worded them differently, but it was the same kind of things as COPS, right? It's observable, that it's a coincidence, that it was a known fact, and I think that tellingly, all of them are known facts, which means you're now left with what you now have to do is you have to calculate how many facts the Quran copies that were known and see what the percentage accuracy is. And you're pointing out things that are more or less accurate. Some of them I think are your interpretation, but you're pointing out things that are more or less accurate, but then but then anytime something that would be raised that's inaccurate, you'll say that verse is unclear, you're adding your interpretation to it, or some other reason to dismiss it. And that's where the evidence or your good evidence amounts to is that you have determined which ones you want to keep, and then you've come up with reasons to reject everything else. So I'm not saying that nothing in the Quran is scientifically accurate. What I'm saying is that it has a normal mix of accurate and inaccurate statements, and you're just going to ignore the inaccurate ones and keep the accurate ones.
I don't think there's any inaccurate statements in the Quran. I think it's 100% in a complete agreement with modern science, which is part of the scientific.
Well, yeah, but when I cite something like the sun setting in a pool of water, you're going to say that that's describing Dulkarnain's perspective and not describing physical
we could do
reality. That I mean, it's just and that will be what you'll say when I go to any verse that on the surface appears to be a scientific error, and I won't say that it's utterly impossible that any of those things could be correct, right? Any of those interpretations could be correct. It's possible that in some cases it is metaphorical. Like, for example, the seven heavens thing. I think that is definitely intended to be metaphorical and is not a scientific error. But you're always going to come to the conclusion that anything that doesn't line up with science has some other explanation. Either it's been misinterpreted, or it's metaphorical, or or we don't know what it means. And anything that you think is accurate, you're going to say that your interpretation of that verse is good, it corresponds to reality, and it counts as valid evidence. And that's where I think your difficulty is going to lie, is coming up with a consistent standard that you can apply to all verses the same, rather than picking and choosing the standard you apply to each verse.
Okay. So it looks like we're almost out of time here. I think we've been at this for about 3 hours. almost.
Yeah, we're going on 3 hours. So, you know, a lot of people give me crap about having you on this
I know.
show,
Well, that's a
but
great compliment for me. That shows that
right,
I do damage to them. Because if I was just a joke, if I was just some clown, they wouldn't care. Oh yeah, there's that guy again. Yeah, sure, no problem. So that's a wonderful compliment.
yeah. So what I was going to follow that up with is I don't care what other people's
Hmm.
opinion is, right? Because this is my
Yeah,
channel and I'll decide who gets to come on. And I thought it was a good discussion. I thought
yeah.
that uh, you did as reasonable a job of defending your position as possible. I obviously, ultimately, I don't think it was successful, but I think it was a worthwhile and
Yeah.
beneficial discussion. So if you want to leave it here, that's fine with me. Or if you want to do a quick example, that would also be fine with me.
Well, yeah, I think we got to wrap up. But
Okay.
what I would just kind of going back to the topic is to learn more about Quran and Science version 2.0. I would encourage them to watch my debate with David Wood on this topic. I think if you just type in our names and something science something or another. In fact, I think I did have it up here. Let me just give you the exact wording. It is, does science prove Muhammad is a true prophet? This is the latest and greatest version of Quran and Science. Everything we've been discussing about, the barriers and things like that, that's all version 1.0, and that's fine to debate, but we should all be on the latest version and see how how science is positively identifying Muhammad as a true prophet, because there's many ways. It's not just scientific miracles. That's all I would have to say on that.
Okay. Um, it, did you want to make a closing summary, or is that sufficient?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. That's good.
Okay. I'll just say a couple words
Yeah.
here as my closing thoughts. So, Logician Bone says Pliny is correct. Freshwater is lighter. It's almost word for word agreement with scientific studies cited by the website Answer in Genesis. Nadir's logic from earlier now means Pliny is inspiration evidence. And I think if he's being consistent, he would have to say that's evidence. Now, he might say that there isn't sufficient evidence when you look at the total of
Hmm.
Pliny's work. But if he's being consistent, he would have to say that that statement it does provide some evidence. And I actually think Nadir's approach is correct in a sense. What we do want to do is we do want to look at uh, kind of the maximal facts case, look at all the evidence and see where it aligns.
Hmm.
Uh, we, I think it's a bad habit of, I was going to say religious people, but really all people, uh, when having arguments, to try to come up with proof texts. Try to come up with a slam dunk argument that cannot be gotten around in any possible way. And in reality, that doesn't exist outside of formal logic. There's always interpretation.
Hmm.
There's always judgment. There is no such thing as pure science, right? The There are observations, but any observation requires interpretation by the scientist. And so we need to look at the totality of evidence. And when we look at the totality of evidence, we find some things in the Quran that are correct, some things that are incorrect, and we find some things in the Quran that correspond to what the Bible teaches, some things in the Bible uh, some things in the Bible are, can be interpreted as correct scientific statements. Other things in the Bible can be interpreted as incorrect scientific statements. Atheists do this all the time. They tell us that this is why you shouldn't believe in the Bible. And my position on the Bible and science is consistent, that I don't think that the Bible is making scientific statements. It is teaching general truths about physical reality, um, for example, that God created, but isn't teaching specifics. When the Bible describes creation as taking place in 7 days, I have no disrespect for any Christian who interprets that as seven literal 24-hour days, or more precisely, six literal 24-hour days, and a seventh day that doesn't have a marked end in the text, so some people would say is ongoing. I don't have a problem with someone interpreting that way. I just think that it doesn't really treat the text as serious. they would say that they're treating the text very seriously, very literally. But if the author didn't intend it to be literal, then I think it isn't treating the text seriously to make it literal. And when the Bible describes creation as taking place in 6 days, I don't think it's tending to teach you about the length of time it took place, rather that God brought creation about in stages. Um, Now you can say, it's long periods of time, that's a definition of day, and I think that also misses the point, because that's not really the point either. It's not, the point isn't that it's that you can push on the meaning of the word day to make it mean long periods of time, because what I think the best interpretation of that text is that it's teaching you a overarching, very important truth, but it's not teaching you something about the days of creation. It's not teaching you something about the length of time. And I think that when you look at all of the biblical statements, you won't find anything that is a direct contradiction to science, but you will find lots of things that are properly understood as being poetic descriptions, properly understood as teaching broad general truths. And I don't think that corresponding to science then is an argument for or against the Bible, because I don't think that's what the text intends. Um, and I would suggest that Muslims would be better off taking the same approach with the Quran, that they say it doesn't generally make scientific statements. Uh, I think there are a couple things in the Bible and a couple things in the Quran that probably are scientific statements, but it's the exception, not the rule. And thus, I would encourage Muslims to look at the totality of the evidence and come up with better reasons to believe that Islam is the truth. And I would have to agree with Ali Dawah that this isn't an argument that they should be using. That said, I do respect Nadir for being willing to defend his position. I ask many, many Muslims to defend their position, and most don't. And to be fair, probably most Christians, if they're asked by a Muslim to defend their position, won't either. So I'm not, passing it too harsh a judgment against those Muslims, but it does mean that I really appreciate anyone who is willing to come on and defend their position. So I thank Nadir for coming on. I'll be happy to have him on again to continue this discussion or look at the scientific accuracy of the Quran, or to have some other discussion. And incidentally, he's coming on next weekend to discuss slavery in Islam with Mary. So Nadir's not afraid of the hard subjects. A lot of people are no doubt making comments about what a jokey is or whatever. But he's willing to defend the position, which a lot of Muslim apologists aren't.
Like, for example, if a Christian apologist, whether it's David Wood or whoever, goes onto a Muslim channel, Dawa-wise or whatever it is, they're going to experience the same thing. Everybody's in the chat is going to throw rotten tomatoes at him. They're going to say the same things that they're saying about me. And the same thing with the atheists. Everyone does that.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, that's kind of the nature of the game, that it doesn't matter if your arguments are good or bad, people are going to say the same thing. Now, George said anyone can defend against you, Thaddeus. I have no idea what that's even supposed to mean, George, but my email is listed in the video description. If you think I actually not even sure if that's supposed to be an insult or it's supposed to be a compliment. But if you're saying that you can, make good arguments and make me look like a fool or whatever because I'm so weak, then by all means, my email's listed. I invite you to come on and do that. So one final question from Nina here. Has Nadir considered talking to Ali Dawah about this?
No, I don't think those guys. See, I don't want to say anything disparaging, but my door is always open. I don't think those guys are willing to open up this discussion on their viewpoint, because I don't think they understand Quran and science well enough, and they know it. And but my door is always open for them.
All right. Now, so the invitation is open, and I would say the same thing. Now, to be fair, Ali Dawah has over 1 million subscribers. I wouldn't say he's running from me just because he's not interested in talking to me, or that he's running from Nadir just because he's not interested in talking. But the invitation's there. If Ali Dawah is interested, any Muslim watching this, feel free to tell Ali Dawah that he is welcome to come on. You can see that I have very friendly discussions. When it's just me, when some of my guests behave differently, but when it's just me, my philosophy is that the truth is apparent, and you don't need to like insult someone or beat them over the head to make that the case. I think the truth speaks for itself, and I hope that others see the truth through this. And if not, well, then that's a failure of me. But thank you all for joining us today. I already mentioned next Sunday, Mary will be on with Nadir. I have a couple other things upcoming on my calendar. I will not be on Tuesday. I normally stream Tuesday nights, but it is the 4th of July, national holiday in America. So I will not be streaming on Tuesday. I'll next be on Wednesday. I'll be on God Logic's channel to continue our challenge to Muslims to call in and bring their best examples of scientific miracles. So right on the same topic. So if you enjoyed today, be sure to check that out. Obviously not posted yet, but be on the lookout for that. Until we meet again, go and serve the Lord. God bless everyone.